Again, I wish I could talk with him so that we could have that conversation, so we could finish closing down philosophy to the sophistry so endemic in philosophy departments. As you know, it's like once you realize that the missing piece of logic is continuous recursive disambiguation, you lose all the apparent profundity that's not there. When you operationalize language, you end up with all the sophistry gone. When you realize that there's a science of testimony and morality, then that part of philosophy is gone. So what's left with philosophy? It's the determination of a set of preferences given context, and that's all there is left. So it's the philosophy isn't of morality. There's no truth to be found in philosophy. It's all in science now. It's just preference. And so what should philosophers be talking about? Well, given these constraints of sovereignty, reciprocity, truth, duty, markets, and everything, what is the network of goods that we can bring about at this point in time? I mean, I don't know. I listen to these guys and all they do is make me angry now. It's like I can't read a philosophy paper without just shaking my head and being disgusted. They're just male and female. They're just biases. That's why I don't like, what's his name? Sheldrake is a fucking ass clown, but what's his name is just as bad. Master Emissary by McGilchrist.
Yep.
Another ass clown. The Master of the Emissary. Yeah, you have all these guys trying so desperately to take some emotion and from some religious experience and create a suicide. It's like the Germans, right? They can't freaking deal with science, so they create philosophy. Same with the Celts. They can't deal with science, so they got to bring in some woo-woo. You know, I just don't get it. It's like, unless you're English, why do the English not bring in woo-woo? I'd like to know, because it's just rare. Anyway, so McGilchrist comes along with the Master and the Emissary. Well, that's just predator and prey, the observer and the actor. Fear, awareness, and opportunity, action. And it's how sex differences in brains are organized.
My interpretation of McGilchrist is he's representing in his book the social influence of the relative bias in the social environment is what he's responding to.
Yes. But again, this is the problem. If you don't go to first causes, you make all these doorways for woo-woo. So if he started out with, this is the physics of it, this is the biology of it, this is the behavioral expression of it, and this is the social manifestation of it, that would be great. But every time you don't do that, you create this freaking venue for magical thinking. And a lot of the people want magical thinking.
Well, what I think was interesting about McGilchrist was he related the scientific revolution, so 1730 on, and the Industrial Revolution, which followed, as excessive male influence in the social environment. And it's like this. I think he got it twisted in the 20th century because it's excessive female response, but the female response is guided by the herdsman, which is the patriarchy writ large, which is what he's responding to, because we're exhausting the physical opportunities of the planet, which is too much predatory response.
Let me explain this for the audience because it's actually easily understood. So the empirical revolution, or the Aristotelian restoration, begins in around 1200 with the restoration of trade in the north and the reintroduction of Aristotle, because the Muslim scholars had fled refundamentalization. So what happens here is that you have a normal technical opportunity to knowledge. So any knowledge that provides a technical opportunity is valuable. But any knowledge that provides a social disruption, or God forbid, a psychological disruption, is highly resistant. So what happens is we work the Aristotelian message through the scientific into the commercial, into the technological, into the industrial. We work it through this path. So what's happening at Darwin is it's making it into the social. By Spencer, it makes it into the social. And by the eugenics, it's made it past the social into the political. But what happens is World War II. So it's natural. He's half correct. It's just that the masculine is less resistant to adaptation than the feminine. In other words, the scientific, technological, and economic is an advantage for males, but it's a cost for females. So we were working that cost through the system. What happened is the world wars happened at a point that brought Hitler into being, and it was the combination of Hitler, the necessity of demonizing Hitler and the Nazis to get political momentum, and the post-war Jewish intellectual movement back into the West as a revolt against the Darwinian revolution and the eugenics revolution. It's not that they didn't have reason for it, right? I mean, it was used against them. But they came here, and the problem is we had liberated women because by bringing them into the workforce during the war, and they found a ready population of newly risen serfs, females this time, ready to hear a message of empowerment, that previous constraints were gone and that they were oppressed. Not that they were being domesticated, not that their natural intuitions are criminal, in other words, socially and politically undermining. Not that the women can't conduct warfare just as successfully as men, they just do it against societies. Not that women were constrained just as much as men, but they were constrained in their domain, which was family and society, from getting out of hand, both by men and by each other. But we liberated all that. So he's trying to cast an emotional, he's contributing to the false demonization of the male, when it's simply that we didn't complete the science of behavior equally to the science of technology. We didn't finish that sequence before the war ended, and then they turned into a new religion. It's not any different from the emergence of Christianity as a result of the Roman expansion. So it's the same stupid thing. We got another religion out of it. Or why the Iranians invented monotheism in order to war against the Indians. It's the same crap going on all over again. So yeah, it's a new religion. And yeah, he's casting it, but this is the problem with not understanding.
McGilchrist. You mean McGilchrist.
And McGilchrist is just like, he's not quite as bad as some absolute lunatic like Sheldrake. Or almost every philosophy professor today is an ass clown. But if you don't know the first principles, you have to explain things in these shallow, moralizing, fictional, mythical nonsense, which might be comforting storytelling, but it's still mythology. And what the problem is, once you've inculcated people with mythology, they have no way of getting out of it. You have to re-educate them rather than educate them. We've looked at why 20th century philosophy failed to formalize, and this is why. They were trying to make philosophy and logic of words and sets into a thing like mathematics. In other words, proofs. We understand that mathematics doesn't produce proofs either. It produces a constructive claim of possibility.
So they were stuck in a mathiness.
They were stuck in mathiness too. And so we flipped it on its head and said, no, there's no proof, there's falsification. There's survival.
There, that's it. They were stuck in via positiva.
Yeah, and they start thinking that math is something different from language. Math is just the dumbest possible language.
Just the most reductive.
Well, to some people, belief is clearly distinguished from trust. Well, faith is clearly disambiguated from trust. But are faith and belief disambiguated? If you're skilled enough, you know that faith is a theological concept, belief is a rationalist concept, and trust is an empirical concept, existential concept. Do people understand that? No, they just throw these fucking words around because in general they mean the same thing to them. Because they don't distinguish between whether they're believing something, they have trust in something because they have the evidentiary knowledge of it. They have trust in something because they have a rational belief in it, or they have trust in something because they have fucking faith in it. Well, those are just three statements of a spectrum of knowledge and ignorance. So you have faith in what you can't possibly understand, you have belief in what you might understand, and you have trust in what you do understand. But people throw these words around as if they're equivalencies. Well, this is how the faithful and the philosophical get away with pretending they're as knowledgeable as the empirical. In other words, ambiguity is a way of lying. Most lying is a pretense of knowledge. And so ambiguity is the means by which this spectrum, the rationalists complain they're as right as the empiricists, and the theological is right as the rationalists and empiricists, or more so because they have faith. Well, no, that's just lying. You're confusing your willingness to make a decision to act with how others will choose to act. You may have faith, or you might have belief, or I might have trust, but trust is a higher knowledge component than belief and faith. People conflate all these terms, but the fact that they don't understand this division is the underlying problem we're trying to solve. We're trying to prevent people from claiming knowledge they don't have and separating their willingness to act with the knowledge they have, which may be necessary, from political knowledge, which by using their argument, they're demonstrating they lack the knowledge to act. By the fact that you're substituting a faith or belief argument for empirical argument is evidence that you have a lower standard and you want people to act on your lower standard rather than you to act on their higher standard of knowledge. So you want people to trust you, though you're admitting that you're ignorant and lying. And they want you to trust them because they're telling the truth, but you can't understand it. And so this is the problem of teaching the population continuous recursive disambiguation through operationalization and serialization to produce language as a system of measurement, so that even if you don't understand, you can be educated and you don't have to be coerced. And even if you don't understand, you can understand that the person is making an argument that's empirical rather than rational, justificationary, or faithful, which is evasionary. Truth, which is just is. Justification is just that, is excuse making. And theology is excuse making by abandoning their responsibility for actually learning anything. Why I used to dislike math is because I have a particular aversion to puzzles instead of problems. And in computer science, you solve problems, not puzzles. And in math, there's too much of it, it's just puzzle solving. And so I had an aversion to a lot of math, whereas programming, you're always solving a real problem. Same thing with that difference between science and engineering. In engineering, you're solving a problem. Well, it's the same thing with philosophizing and law. Philosophy is largely puzzles, and most of them are nonsense. Law isn't. It's just
it's engineering. It's
engineering. Reading Germans is questionable, and it's like, I don't know how to be wrong but beautiful. I don't know how to get, it's like they can't escape Catholicism or Protestantism, one or the other. If you read Spengler is really good, but it's like, as inspirational as Nietzsche is, Spengler is depressing. That's a great example of what's wrong with Continental, is it's always loaded. It has to have emotional impact in order to sell. What I love with Anglos is that it's legal. It's like testimony in court. So it's unloaded. Now, it might still include value judgments, and they would rarely be wrong, but English history is more scientific. And so you get a Quigley out of it. You get read Quigley, and it's so pure. It's so unloaded. And he really developed what I consider, he really scienced history. So the only test of truth is exhaustive correspondence with reality. Exhaustive. It's not just trying to say it in logic, which is why I give up on people who learn philosophy, because they always come back into some recursive explanation. I'm like, you don't understand. The missing law from logic is continuous recursive disambiguation, and you didn't just continuously recursive disambiguate, which means you didn't add additional information. Since you didn't add information, you've created undecidability, not contradiction. So logic is lost. I mean, all philosophical sophisms are based on this one failure of grammar, which is continuous recursive disambiguation. And while Chomsky is the one who put it in, Chomsky took Turing and put Turing into linguistic form. This is his phrase. I like to use him because it's a radical left. He's like the opposite of me. But I have to credit him with taking Turing and applying it to language, even though Chomsky is a profound liar. So this is why the liar's paradox isn't one. Everything inside this box is a lie. It's not continuously recursive disambiguation. Instead, the opposite. It relies on recursion to create ambiguity. In other words, it's a grammatically incorrect statement. It isn't confusing at all. It isn't a paradox. It's a lie. Well, every, quote, deep philosophical question, almost everyone. I mean, I'm just trying to shit on philosophy as much as I can right now. Most philosophy relies on two things. One, the failure to include continuous recursive disambiguation for grammatical correctness. This is partly because of mathematics does this. In other words, mathematics doesn't include it because mathematics is based on balances, not on operations. So the second one is the use of the word is, which is ambiguous. It means I don't want to put the work into stating the state of this thing, the existential state of this thing. So is the primary source, or the verb to be, is, are, was, were, etc. These are means of claiming knowledge you don't have, knowledge you haven't demonstrated, and attributing causality where there is only some vague association or identity.
Oh, what was
between
that you said about identity?
they're claiming an identity where there isn't one. For example, well, that is just X. Well, no, it isn't just X. There's a vague similarity between these things if you wish to reach to some fucking conflation, but causally there's no relationship at all. So most bullshit argument, most philosophical sophistry makes use of those two things on top of some bias.
Yep.
That is all your brain does. When you say intuition, that's all it's doing.
It's just weighing it out.
It's just doing that. That's it. There's nothing else going on. Every decision in your brain is based on, am I going to acquire something?
I think you just called me a bot, man.
Well, we are all bots. That's the point. That's all that's going on. And what gets your attention, that's it. So basically, you got a brain that senses the world through the dumbest thing possible, pressure, change, whatever, and they all go together. And because they're proximal to think different things, it organizes them into some world model. The world model turns out to be disturbingly accurate. The real problem is that world model has to be converted into a spatial model in order for you to act. So you assemble this picture, basically. You assemble a picture because half our neurology is devoted to sight. We're visual creatures, especially when we look at women. You divide all these things up. It produces a coherent image. It breaks that image into objects, spaces, and boundaries, and it attributes a value to the object. And it's either an opportunity or a cost.
In a balance, right? In a balanced arrangement.
In a competition. So basically, your whole brain is running a competition for what should I acquire.
And what's funny is it's operating at this very low level in the brainstem. It's like, hey, wake up.
It's incredibly dumb. Nature is dumb. It just uses lots of stuff to make complexity. And so your attention, when you say something gets your attention, it's because it's an opportunity or a risk, a gain or a loss. And then once it sees that, the rest of your brain holds that attention and does auto association to do a continuous recursive pathway to get there. Wayfinding. So that's it. That's all that happens.
Yes.
Nothing else happens. And meanwhile, in the next half a second, another competing idea comes in and either gets your attention or not. And these networks sort of stay alive long enough. So some of us can think of one thing at a time. Some of us sort of two. Some of us can remember the last three. And some autists like me lose the fucking idea of whatever we're talking about in a heartbeat. What's going on up there is really dumb. That's why consciousness is not complicated. It's just a hierarchy of memories, right? Yeah. And we can't separate them, so we experience them as a stream. But that's all. It's just a bunch of memories of memories of memories of memories. When I think of memory, I mean, it's memory of the last part of a second. And then the auto association of those parts of memories with every other memory we've got in our heads. You know, it's basically how many Christmas tree lights can we light up in order to feel like we can find an opportunity. It's like the dumbest thing in the world. That's why it's so beautiful, so wondrous, and so frustrating. There's a miracle, this miracle of being human, and all the fantasies and stories and myths and lies and ambitions, all the stories we tell us ourselves. But underneath it, we're a fucking cuckoo clock. You know what I mean? It just, this, you know, we're not special. We're just more of it. There's a tendency for people on the right to fall into the three groups. And it's normal because we all follow what has the greatest number of associations for us because that's the least neural cost. Right. So we tend to build upon whatever foundations we find. Now, we know that theological basis is based on indoctrination. We know that the philosophical basis is largely based on self-learning. And we know the scientific basis is based largely on formal education. And so this is sort of like saying, you know, what kind of fiction books do you like to read? Mystery or science? You know, I mean, it's the same kind of thing where you tend to learn a paradigm and you like to work within whatever emotes you the most because of its associations. So because of that, you have the sciencey guys like us, the philosophy guys, and the religious guys. And there's also the ideology guys. And ideology is, in formal sense, means under democracy, it became possible to shortcut the rigor of theology and philosophy and merely appeal to motivate people toward an end under democracy. That's what an ideology means. Let me just get a little dig on philosophy geeks. Philosophy's done, okay? It's a joke. Philosophy's done. Philosophy is limited now to preference, choice of preference, not truth. So my favorite part of philosophy is the true-false dichotomy. Actually, no, it's undecidable, possibly true, and false, but false is the greatest certainty. That's ternary logic. False is the highest certainty. Undecidable, possibly true, and false. Why is truth possible? Because, so the problem is, until we discover the first principle of any domain, then all knowledge is open to incremental increase. Even systems of knowledge are open to incremental increase, or domains of knowledge. But false is the only thing we know for certain. So this is what you get into with mathiness. The laws of logical inference are false because they're only telling you about inference, not about truth. So a statement is inferable, but that doesn't mean it's true, right? The premises. But we, in computer science and databases, we distinguish between undecidable, null, unknown, no, and true and false. And we understand that false is more meaningful than true, because false is decidable and truth is not. So that's why falsificationary logic is so important, is because we can be certain something is false by our inability to construct it from first principles. But we can never really know if something is true because the context application of the general rule, that's what a general rule is. It's a search criteria for application, but the context determines the application. So until we get into an individual context, we don't have enough information to be able to decide which general rules apply and not. So truth is almost always open to reformation. So therefore, when we say something's true, we're saying that it's warrantable as satisfying the demand for liability. It's warrantable in liability in the context. Everything we're doing is along the spectrum, not this binary true-false nonsense. And the problem is mathiness and philosophy-ness are shit, and they're fucking everywhere, and they're poisoning the well for every goddamn thing you want to think about. But what does the average idiot do? The average idiot would rather read science fiction or mythology or theology or philosophy, which philosophy is Plato, right? Philosophy is literature. It's not evidence. It's literature. It's analogy. Where you get to science is operational. You know, we did better than the English and the Canadians and the Australians at resisting the left because our law is not fussy. It's not philosophical. Our law is science.
Right.
And my changes to our law make it hard science. The thing is, some of us in Northern Europe, for ancestral reasons, we just happen to be really good at sticking with show me. You know? No, I'm not doing it unless you show me. And so we've developed show me culture, and we've never made institutions powerful enough to overcome show me culture. So we've maintained an empirical view of the world incrementally over time. Because we got to do something, because this whole counter-revolution, people say, well, you talk about the Jews doing this. Well, the Jews did it, but it's not like the Germans and the French didn't do it before the Jews. It's not like the Chinese didn't do it. It's not like the Muslims are not trying to. Everybody resists the truth. The British are very unique in that they created an aristocratic society, and that lasted right up until the First World War. And this aristocratic society created an aristocratic religion, which is an empowering one, right? I mean, it's a cult. And so for some reason, the British and the Dutch and somewhat the Germans could tolerate modernity. But so far, everybody else can't. They hate it. They just hate it because it's so disruptive. And they're so used to not having the discipline that's required of an Aristotelian pagan Protestant. They're so used to the evasion of responsibility, letting them emotionally free ride, that they can't even imagine what it's like, and they resist it. So you get French sophomoric and pseudoscientific rationalism they call the Enlightenment. It's the counter-Enlightenment. The Germans trying to recreate the Bible and philosophy with Kant and Hegel. They're just trying to create a rational secular theology. You get the Jews just creating Marxism, neo-Marxism, postmodernism, feminism, PC woke as their reformation. And you get Islam doubling down on fundamentalism by the 20s, right? And then you get this really radicalization of it in the 70s. And you get Chinese, now they're doubling down on this weird combination of Confucianism and Maoism and Statism, which is just
fascism, yeah.
And you get the Indians like trying to be British, but socialist. Sometimes I think Africans are the only sane people. And that's terrifying. They just don't have enough stupid shit in their past. You know, they don't have any really bad mistakes in their past to double down on. They don't have any stupid ideas. We don't realize that the major civilizations went through the agrarian phase and had to produce some stupid ideas to make that work. And now we all want to double down on our past stupid ideas. And then we had this empirical reformation of the Europeans coming back from their dark age. And everybody says, holy shit, no, that's Indo-European. That means that our stupid shit we came up with in the agrarian age is under threat. We got to resist. And it's like, you're just doubling down on this genuine decline. It's like, I get very tired.
That's why I write my white papers. I'm like trying to make it so that it's understandable in as succinct a fashion as possible. Throw the gauntlet down. It's like, come on, learn it. It's just like dog treats.
But like, you have to teach people basic words, like what do logic and science and philosophy mean, right?
And distinguish it from opinion and preference.
And they'll go, well, philosophy means the love of, well, it does not. It means an organized system of reasoning. The criteria is, what are the limits that you put on your criteria of reasoning? Like Plato, Platonic reasoning, or you put Aristotle, which is empirical reasoning, or scientific means testifiable reasoning. And when it's testifiable, can you see it survive logical falsification by all these means? I mean, when you say philosophy, which thing are you talking about? Because it's like it's excuse making most of the time. I mean, that's most philosophy is excuse making. It's basically another means of, let's think of some set of ways to persuade other people to agree with me. This is what I just hate this. I used to say the purpose of philosophers in the end is to police the informational commons. And they said, well, no, that's too limited. I went, well, because reality is what most philosophy is fantasy literature, fantasy moral or fantasy political literature. It's like everybody says, well, everything in history is a footnote to Plato, but Plato was fucking wrong. And so that means all philosophy is shit. And it is. And I keep saying to people that there's nothing, it's like, I'm not the only person who said, you can study all this philosophy and there's absolutely nothing valuable there at all, except the record of human error. Whereas if you look at the sciences, it's like, holy shit. I mean, we do get the occasional phlogiston theory, or we get like a half truth, like Einsteinian space. It doesn't mean it isn't continuously progressing rapidly. We have to find a story that unifies tribes.
So that's what the philosophers are doing right now. They're working to generate a new story that is generally agreeable and acceptable as a new mythos for the purpose of generating the universal empire. The people on the left are of the opinion that they can generate the universal empire, which is Quigley's universal empire, which is how do we solve the crisis of the moment? We generate the universally acceptable political solution, which generates the universal empire, which is degenerative. That's Quigley, not you. Or we figure out how to get around this silly nonsense and we circumvent their monopolistic behavior and we get back to proper evolutionary processes.
Federations cooperate, empires conflict. The problem is that we don't think of intellectual history as fantasy moral literature, and that's what it is.
Philosophy is what you had said.
Yeah,
right?
Philosophy is fantasy moral literature. And so just like there's fantasy literature in ordinary literature, and there's history as somewhere between narration, storytelling, and fiction, right? I mean, because all history has got to be centered around some theme, or you can't comprehend it because it would just be disparate facts. So they have to tell a story. So you don't think of history and literature and philosophy as just the same thing, as some variation on fantasy moral literature. And so the problem with philosophy is you pay this high cost to get into it. And because you've paid that high cost, you don't want to pay the high cost again for learning physics or for learning mathematics or for learning programming or for learning chemistry or biology or economics.
Right. It's. I would say there's no incentive to do so if you can make a living doing philosophy.
Correct. So my problem, of course, is that I think, philosophy is just a fucking joke and has been for over 100 years now. Now, you can say that there's been progress in philosophy. I would actually, there's been progress in converting philosophy to the scientific method and converting linguistics into logic. But I'm not sure there's been any progress in philosophy. There appears to have been none. And everything I can see in it turns out to have been false. So what's the difference between philosophizing and theorizing? And that's the change that's happened, is we've moved from philosophizing, which is generally a conflation of the good and the true, to theoretizing, which is the true from which we determine goods. So I just see the 20th century as working our way through logic and ending up realizing it's not mathematics. Right. And working our way through mathematics and realizing its computational reducibility is limited. The same thing with logic. Linguistic computation is limited and it's falsificationary. Completely the opposite of what we thought in both fields. And so when I talk to philosophers, they're using essentially set theory still instead of operationalism. Just like mathematics is using sets rather than operationalism. Whereas computation is using operationalism. And physics is using operationalism, and we, in incentives, are using operationalism. So this is why I say what went wrong is Babbage understood operationalizing, and he didn't create a theory of it. It's not that computation didn't improve, but it wasn't until Turing that he wrote it down as a theory. And it wasn't until Chomsky's interpretation of Turing in linguistics that got us to continuous recursive disambiguation. And I'm the one that's taken that and said, okay, here's the fundamental law of the universe, continuous recursive disambiguation at a point of stable relation that we call an identity that persists, right? And so, I mean,
I just find this to be just stunningly, it's just funny to me, right?
Why?
It's funny to me because it's like this. The philosophers were talking about God, which is how I ended up in the conversation I was in. What's interesting is this, is like, look, is the operationalization of understanding allows you to understand God, the creator of all, that didn't destroy, that it lived, the identities which survive persist, right?
Correct.
It's one of the secret names.
You repeat that because
I know, I got it jumbled up.
You're shuffling, but lost it. So say it again.
Okay. Is to have identified the operational secret of the universe is funny to me because it's like the word of God himself.
Exactly.
And it's like, but one of the secret name of God is I am, is the surviving entity, is the persistent one. It's an identity and it identifies itself by being. And
I think you have a wonderful ability to take this. You've done it a couple of times today, and I only recognized it last week. You really are attracted to symbolism, association between symbolism, which is a sort of set theory. The thing is that when you do that, you are correctly tying it back to the problem of the past, which is non-causal relations. The auto-association between sets instead of causal relations. So what I like when you do this, despite the fact that it makes the hair on my back and my neck stand up, this auto-associative symbolism is really close to intuition. It's why religions work and storytelling works, whatever. It's because it doesn't require the knowledge that a causal relation does. It just relies on your auto-association to identify a pattern through the telling of a story. But it's actually the entire problem. It's that we didn't have the knowledge of causal relations, and now we do. And so we can speak and think operationally in causal relations. But the problem is so many people are so habituated to what I call set theory or auto-associative thinking that they're so indoctrinated in it that they can't evolve to pay the cost of recursively thinking about what they just said as what's the causal relation here? This explains how difficult the jump is. The reason theology and storytelling work is because you can use anthropomorphic characters with anthropomorphic measurements, sense, perception, emotion, whatever, without actually understanding causality. It's purely auto-associative. It's very emotional. It's incredibly effective for that reason. It also bypasses reason on purpose. This is important, is that by being inarticulate auto-associative properties of sets, it actually allows you to circumvent the demand for causal relations. So we're trying to make humans make a fundamental leap. They had to go from discrete knowledge to continuous knowledge. In other words, from a lot of things that were just learned as facts and into general rules, which we call science. So a very large number of general principles reduced to general rules. This is where about half of the odd increase in intelligence over the century came from. Part of it's from cutting out the stupid people at the bottom through ending malnutrition and whatever else. But the rest of it happened from generalizing principles, which is what we call science, instead of all these independent fictions that were built on, well, God willed it or, whatever. So we found general rules. We're trying to now take these from general rules and sets, which is how mathematics works, to one single rule and operational construction from it. This is a big leap we're taking, but the same benefit we got from generalization of norms in religion to generalization of concepts in science and empiricism to generalization of everything into testimony. This is a big set of evolutionary leaps that we're asking people to take. But we have to overcome the fact that just like it took work to get you, it was easy to teach you parables. You could advance that into theology. It was easier to teach you some general rules about the universe into a craft. But it was hard to teach people to move from those superstitious and traditional means of knowledge to general knowledge of empiricism and science. And it's as big a deal to move people from empiricism and science of sets, realize it's general rules of sets, to the one general rule of operational construction. One of the reasons I love working with you is that you're demonstrating the journey that people have to go through, but you have these normie, you're a good example of what normal people think if they're brought up in theology, philosophy, right, empiricism, and the sciences.
I'm recovering from the 20th century still. The interesting function of it, it goes like this. So I bring in auto-associative functions because it resonates with the normies, and it needs to resonate with the normies. You just show the causal relationships once they recognize the resonance, because they want resonance.
Yes.
Because that will make them happy. It makes their heart warm, and then they will recognize an incentive to continue to study.
Anyway, but we're taking them to operationalism, which, gets born back in the 1830s, but it's taken till now to work. And if you look at history, that's what happens. It takes 4 generations or more. It takes a Babbage, a Turing. It takes the combination of a Hoppe and Popper, 2 guys who came in at completely opposite directions, a scientist and a philosopher. They both come together and like Popper says, I learned more from you than I have from anybody except Tarski. And Hayek says something similar, is that, well, I learned how to think about this problem. But I look at the both of them and I'm like, well, I understand what you're both are doing in context. It's just you're trying to make this conversion. And the only reason it happened was accidental. It didn't happen because philosophers succeeded. It didn't happen because scientists succeeded. It happened because engineers succeeded and developed programming. And from programming, we looked back on the engineering and saw a theory. And from the theory, we generalized the theory to epistemology. And from epistemology, we generalized the theory to language. And from language, I got to, holy shit, language is just the means by which we describe the entire universe that is describable by us. And it's all measurements. And those measurements are just what's ever reducible to analogy to human experience. But all language is just the continuous recursive disambiguation of operations, objects and operations, into an identity that is unambiguously separable from the background and therefore persists. And it's like, okay, well, we're just fucking computers. It's really goddamn annoying at that length. We're just binging all this shit in and auto-associating it and then trying to create a pathway, which is, in other words, maze finding. And the only reason you can do maze finding is because you have recursion. And how does the nervous system work? It works by no principle other than recursion, which is why the philosophers are lost because they can't even comprehend this concept, right? It's just recursive feedback loops, and which is all the time delay is what causes this sensation to compete with that sensation to cause a continuity or not, which is that's all the fucking nervous system does in vast numbers. And so you can't even have an adult conversation with a philosopher because the idea of that is incomprehensible and they're malinvested in all this shit. Pseudoscience.
Behavioral economics, okay? It all comes down to the cheese. Because it's like this, the rat doesn't see the maze. He just sees the cheese, right?
Cheese.
We said this earlier. And it's like this. The problem of philosophy is too much cheese.
Jeez.
There's no sense in even talking about the maze. I'm going to just run around in this room because there's so much cheese.
Cheese. I can find cheese anywhere I go look to find cheese.
The philosophers have developed silos with no walls and cheese.
So here's what I like about philosophy is despite the fact that it's 99%, 99 bullshit, what I like about people who study philosophy is they learn to question. And so philosophy is full of so many errors and it's so bad and so much harm has come from it. I mean, how many people did Marx get killed? How many people did Abraham get killed? How many people are going to pay the cost of the pseudoscience of the Vax era? I knew that would get you. This isn't the bugaboo of mine, but I know it just makes the right go nuts. So when you get to this, I'd like us to study lying as I've proposed it instead of philosophy. In other words, philosophy is the art of sort of identifying all these things that are not right. But the great study of lying is it achieves what philosophy does, except scientifically. So what I learned in studying philosophy, it's very good if you're going to go into law, because what is law? It's organized as philosophy. But once you have what we've done, operationally constructed, ultimately parsimonious natural law, then law is just a science. The problem of the present is that method that's destroyed the ancient world is working to destroy the present world. If you'd asked me 2 centuries ago, if you asked me in the early 1800s, I would have argued against German phenomenalism. If you argued me in the 1700s, I would argue against French moralism. If you had argued against me in the Middle East in 1930, I would argue against Islamic fundamentalism. If you argued against me in 1890, I would argue against Marxism. So we just happen to be in Marxism, neo-Marxism, postmodern, PC woke, which is the culmination of 3 generations of this new application of the Abrahamic method. So I'm against fictionalism's deceits, false promises. It just happens to be there. So the problem is, because the Jewish model is the current cycle of rebellion against the Anglo-restoration of reason, or the Anglo-invention of modernity, I don't have to argue against the French anymore. I don't have to argue against the German anymore, but I still have to argue against the Jewish and Muslim. And now I've got to argue somewhat against the Chinese. And now the Russians have gone backward. I got to show how the Putin is just using the Abrahamic method again. Your neurons grow to be predictive because there's no observer, which is the hard part I can't get across to philosophers, how memory of the past moment is the only observer. The only you that you can consider an observer is a memory of your feeling of homeostasis. Now, that's the you. That when you say I, you don't know what that means, but that's what that thing is. That's the feeling of variation from homeostasis. That's all that is. Because the reason you feel like that is because your body's got to regulate up or down regulate depending on stress or calm. And so all you're feeling ever is when you say you is the consequence of your body trying to upregulate or downregulate. I'm like, so that's a very special, no, it's just what else do you think it's going to feel like? I mean, it's like I was trying to do the thing with somebody the other day, is run your finger along a surface. You know how hard it is to distinguish between what you feel and what you recall because you feel. It's almost, I mean, I can do it because I've like practiced it. So I'm like, I know that that's metal, polished metal, and I know that's screen. But what's the real difference? It's almost nothing. It's just lumpiness. So that's all you're experiencing is auto-association with the prior knowledge of a thing. But realistically, all I can detect is lumpiness and temperature. And the metal is going to be colder, and the Catholic clock.
Right. But how hard is this? How come philosophers can't pick that up?
Well, I mean, because it's like when they say they study neurology, it's like Sam, what's his name? Sam that argues with Peterson. And anyway, between Sam, he's like, I studied neurology. No, he didn't really. He studied brain differences in one particular aspect of the brain. You got this other guy out there, Lawrence Kuhn, and he makes zillions of videos. And he says, well, I have this neurology. No, you don't. He has a particular specialization in measurement of a particular behavior. Sam Harris here. These are both psychology. They're not neuroscience. They're physical, in a sense they're trying to use imaging. But if you want to talk about neuroscience, you need to be able to talk to me about neurocomputation and the means by which neurocomputation is performed, which information is assimilated in the brain, starting with nothing other than pulses. And the only people that I know how to do that I know of, are computer scientists. In other words, the people who work in AI, because we're trying to repeat it. So we think about it operationally. But if you talk to people in the field, they're talking about charges and differences related to medical defects. So they're looking at very small things. Even the AI guys, they say, I specialize in AI. Do you? Or do you specialize in Bayesian learning? There's a very small number of us that specialize in AI.
The calculation is not so much done by the neuron itself, but when do I unconnect and reconnect over here and do this? And it's like, how is that done?
And it does by continually seeking for neural economy by increasing the success of predictions. In other words, so what people keep thinking about, there's like some Platonic model in your head, and that you're comparing that against it. That's not what's happening at all. It's just, did I predict this 5 milliseconds against that 5 milliseconds against that 5 milliseconds? And if I got 3 in a row, I won the tic-tac-toe game and I get to ejaculate neurochemistry. Woohoo! I got 3 strikes in a row. It's like, I got the first base, I got the second base,
Baby.
I got the third place, I got home, I get to ejaculate neurochemistry, which is what the neuron's job is. I just want to ejaculate. The rest of you guys tell me when. You guys got to build up enough charge so that I can have a release. I mean,
That's all a neuron's job is. That's
all
the whole job of the neuron.
It's like this sex economy of information.
Just waiting.
Look, wait a minute. I got to get her closer to orgasm so that she will. So you're playing this game. You don't realize that the reason you feel like that is because that's all your neurons are doing. Isn't that fucked up? Your whole sexual performance is just the repetition of what your dendrites are doing to make a neuron ejaculate. And you're just trying to get a lot of neurons to ejaculate at the same time so that you can cause your body to ejaculate. That is the best, most effective means of communicating how the brain works for every guy I've ever got to teach. Every guy will understand that.
Because it goes like this. That was so good. I'm going to do it again. Note to self, connect all those dots together again as often as possible.
May God have mercy on my soul. I know
And
not what I say.
It goes to homeostasis and neurotropism. What connections do you sever? Which connections do you strengthen?
Right. It's trying to say that there's no observer.
There's no observer.
And there's nothing to
observer
compare against except the last prediction. And so if it turns out that I can make that same connection with fewer dendritic connections of stronger strength by rewiring this way, I'm going to eventually evolve that. It's just like how we make roads. Roads just sort of adapt to wherever the traffic is needed. Same fucking problem.
Because it's like the philosophers. How come you can't talk to the philosophers?
Right.
And it's like, because they keep on making up the ghost in the machine and want to talk about the ghost in the machine, right? Is like, there's a ghost in the machine. I'll tell you about that ghost. And that ghost is fancy and very interesting and quite, I'm the expert on this ghost. And if you come to my school and pay me a lot of money, I will teach you and you can be an expert in this ghost too.
It's exactly what's going on. And it's like, why does science progress with the death of the previous generation of scientists? That's the reason. And so, my view is that actually this is true. The cognitive scientists, who were the real psychologists, spun off from psychology because psychology was so broken. And what you saw was cognitive science reform psychology. Has it reformed therapy? No. But it's reformed what they attempt to make a science of psychology into being operationally based on the structure of the brain. Well, what we're trying to do is the same thing for sociology.
It's an epistemic problem because they're trying to solve for good before they solve for true. That's an error.
It means they're doing philosophy, not science,
Right.
And that's the problem with philosophy, not science.
This is, you guys solve for true before you solve for any kind of good. If you don't distinguish between true and not true, you're not able to find good. It can't be done.
Well, I'll tell you why. Because these guys live in what's called the literary world. It's like Plato versus Aristotle, or philosophy versus science. And so they live in the world of ideas first instead of the world of truth, measurements first. I live in the world of measurements first. I live in the world of the foundation of mathematics, of computation, of what we would call artificial intelligence or cognitive science. I live in the world of physics and neurology. And I live in the world of law and economics. Those are all systems of measurement. They're not systems of preference. They're not systems of consent development. They're just systems of measurement. So once you start with the measurement and you begin to understand falsification or via negativa versus justification or via positiva, and you understand that all logic is actually falsificationary, there's basically no such thing as a proof, a non-reductive proof. You get to the point where you're like, okay, now I have a system of measurement. Now, how do I negotiate with others within these measurements? Instead of how do I negotiate with others independent of measurements? In other words, philosophy encourages you to lie. Theology mandates you lie. So how are you going to produce your means of negotiating? By mandating you lie, by assisting you in lying, or by prohibiting your ability to lie? Well, when you want to negotiate at intertribal scale, religion is enough. If you want to negotiate at interpolitical scale, the philosophy is enough. When you want to negotiate at intercommercial scale, the law is enough. But if you want to negotiate at universal scale, only science is enough. Now, when they say science, I would have to educate them on what science meant. Science is the technology by which we produce testimony in a given domain in pursuit of first principles. Within that domain, meta science, which is what I do, is competing those first principles against one another to produce a consistent and coherent set of principles across all domains. So if you want to call what I do meta, I don't like the word meta. I'm doing this for populars, right? Popular idiots. Meta science, meta ethics, whatever, you can. But the difference is when you know all the disciplines, when you know math and logic, math and algorithms and logic and procedures and law and economics, you know human behavior, demonstrated human behavior. If you don't know those things, you know analogies. And so I don't like this literary camp. The difference is that you need to tell fucking stories to morons to get ideas across because it's too hard to learn the sciences. I'm not calling them stupid. I'm saying you're just unequipped to solve the problem.
You're not coming to bat with the right equipment.
Correct.
That's all. And it's an epistemologic problem. Your epistemology is not correct for solving the problem that you think you're solving.
The tools by which you're trying to solve this problem, the instruments of measurement that you're using to solve this problem are
insufficient. Won't work. They won't work because
they're based on false premises.
I'm objecting to calling people morons. I'm just saying calling them children.
Well, I don't think.
I know it was. I'm just.
Nobody takes me that seriously.
Now that is the segue. Now it's time to get to work. It means I'm going to catch this lizard right now, right before your very eyes. It will be awesome. I will bring him to the camera.
Aren't they faster than you, old man? I thought you were kind of.
Oh, he's cold, buddy. He is not ready. Okay.
Yeah.
You see him? He's looking at me.
I don't see him.
Looking at me. He's looking at me.
How big is he? Oh, he's a big one.
Yeah, he wants outside. Look at that. Wait. Blue belly.
What kind of lizard is that? Do they have a name?
Big.
I understand why people hate me. I had a guy come in yesterday. It's simple. A great example of the most common problem is people want ideology for political power, philosophy to try to organize, or theology to try to resist. That's what they want. I don't do ideology, philosophy, or theology. I do science. The purpose of science is falsificationary. It's a via negativa. It says what not to do. By knowing what not to do, we can invent a set of menus that say, what are some ways of getting what you do want that will work? Because that's what we've narrowed it down to. What that is supposed to do is allow you to create philosophy that is non-false. In other words, organize choices that are not false and irreciprocal. The problem is they don't want that because that requires you to think. It requires you to negotiate, and it requires you to engage in intellectual honesty with the opposition. They don't want that. They want to be told, here's a way of getting power, here's a way to negotiate for what you want, and here's a way to resist. That's what they want. And so the problem is they come to me and says, you expect people to be this rational. No, I don't. I expect judges to be this rational. That's all, because I expect judges to be this rational. So when you come to me and say it's insulting because you people expect to work that way, I says, no, I don't. I don't expect you to be anything other than the human being you are. So my job is to overcome that problem of ideological lies, philosophical lies, and theological lies, and produce a system of measurement, a system of truth, which is a system of measurement, of reciprocity. So, I mean, the problem is these guys keep coming to me and asking me, you should promote fascism and ideology. You should promote, God knows, right? You should promote Christianity, fundamentalist Christianity. You should promote the Catholic Church. You should promote the Constitution as it's written is enough. I mean, these are all resistance, negotiating positions, or searches for power. That's all they are. They're wah, 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 wah. I'm not doing that. People obsess on one thing, like they're given religious doctrine or some branch of philosophy, but there's nothing to be learned there. Everything you learn is through adversarial competition between the civilizations, between the sexes, between the classes. Everything knowledgeable is to be gained is not by attempting to increase the precision of an imprecise thing of marginal indifference, instead of looking at the things that are quite different and understanding how they're differently organized. That's why I say comparative economics, comparative law, comparative religion, comparative philosophy, comparative government, comparative families, comparative marriage rituals, comparative punishments, comparative mythologies, comparative group strategies. It's that comparison at the large scale that gives you insight into the failings of your own. Whereas if you study your own philosophy or some wing of it or some theology, all you're doing is doubling down on previous errors, because there's nothing more to be learned there, which I got from Will Durant. He's like, he goes through and he studies all philosophies, says there's actually nothing to be learned here. So we went and studied history, says it's all there, because that's empirical. But philosophy is just advertising. It's just negotiating principle. It doesn't mean anything. And science is it was the branch of philosophy that attempted to get people out of thinking fanciful thoughts and into understanding the world as it really is, which eventually gave us dominion over the universe. Like, again, I don't know where all this consciousness is coming from. I don't know where all this unique flower is coming from. I mean, the brain is so complicated. It's just not. We know now.
I just find it interesting. I listen to these people talk about consciousness, and there was a little talk about the qualia thing. I'm like, find the whole thing to be a diverticulum. It's just not interesting. It's
a joke. Most philosophers are ass clowns trying to make sure they get their pensions. Even the relatively good ones are just not too bad. Look, an undersea cable, the formula for the transmission loss of an undersea cable and the transmission loss in your neurons is exactly the fucking same. The smarter you are, you have less transmission loss across more neurons, right, that are activated because you have more knowledge and you've made fewer errors. When they say the brain is complicated, it's disingenuous. What they mean is it's complicated to trace a circuit. It's not complicated to map sets of circuits. It's certainly not complicated to map regions that groups of circuits communicate with, or to identify what those do.
Functions, right?
And it's certainly not difficult to trace all of them back to a couple of pathways that integrate them in your hippocampal region into a 3D model of the universe. And then for a little bit of fucking crazy dense neurons down in there, in the EC, whatever it is, 2 or 3, to go off and say, hey, what else looks like this? And then you get to experience all that shit in this great big stream of everyone's, stuff. And you're like, what it's doing is stupid simple, because that's what nature does. It uses stupid simple and big numbers to accomplish ridiculously amazing things. So there's no mystery to the brain. All these people, they've created this pseudo religion. It's really what it is. They've created this pseudo religion out of philosophy of mind. It turns out mind is really simple. We know the circuits. I can explain them all. I have the reason we can't make computers think, or you haven't made it yet, is just because wires can't grow and neurons can. So we have to fake it with addresses.
Simulation, right.
Otherwise, it'd be stupid simple. Nerves do one thing. They vibrate. We have to sort the universe into this amazing model of experience by organizing vibrations so that they make us represent the world as it is. This is fucking amazing. But then you say to yourself, it becomes obvious, well, why does red look like red? Because it's in competition with blue and yellow, and it hasn't got a fucking choice, right? It's got to look like red. We might find another alien that for them, the content of red was muted, but it's going to be red. It's like red-green colorblind. It looks like gray.
It's so interesting is studying the nervous system, and it's all just frequency modulation. It's just frequencies that are being transmitted, and that's all.
And people keep thinking there's like something that it's measured against. It isn't. It's the competition between measurements that lets only reflection of reality survive. Because it's just one thing after another. There doesn't have to be an understanding of the world. There doesn't need to be any a priori knowledge other than the organization of your organs produced by the fact that your neurons are connected to parts of your brain. So they learn by embodiment. Your body is the only instrumental measure that the brain uses to disambiguate all those vibrations into something that make fucking sense to us. That's all. It's offensively simple. So all you do to create different people is you bait neural growth to some part of the sensory system. You just bait neural connectivity to give priority to those neurons so they get attention. Because that's all that you act on. You act on attention. So create more connectivity, you'll get more attention. You want to make a female, bait it into temporal. You want to make a male, bait it into intertemporal. Or at least what you do is you deny it temporal, so all it has is temporal.
Go somewhere else.
So it's just because you got the same volume there, it just got somewhere to go. So the neurons grow with those connectivities instead of others. And that's why we're all over the place. So some guys, they still think like male, but they sort of feel like female. And you get some females that are almost as rational as men. You just get this amazing distribution. And because learning a discipline is neurally expensive, and each of these books is in a different discipline. And so what people tend to do is they learn how to read something in a discipline, and they keep doubling down on it. They don't realize they're making themselves ignorant and difficult to relearn. I get this with, my favorite example is Continental philosophy, which is just a joke. I don't know why people don't hear me when I make this repeated thing, is every single culture rebelled against the Anglo restoration of Mediterranean thought. Every single one. What? They can't handle it. If you look at the legal thinkers today, they're really weak. If you look at the philosophers, they're almost a joke. If you look at the historians, there's no equivalent of Kara Quigley alive today that I know of. They so sufficiently killed our academy since 1950. They've been so successful at it. You can't produce a non-ideological or a non-PC woke politically correct mind. The degree to which the search for equality has destroyed the intellectual body of the country is overwhelming. So yeah, I find my job overwhelming simply because there's really no one you can share it with. Most of these things tend to be the work of one man, but both the theory and application, in other words, both the theory itself and the law itself and the policy, nobody's done that before. It's too hard. It's just science. There's no philosophy left in politics anymore. There's only philosophy left in choice of lifestyle within the politics.
I was engaged in a conversation in textual format with some philosopher types. And it's like watching them, knowing they don't know what they're doing in the context of it with that regard to the sloppiness of the terminology they're employing. And I'm like, okay, no, I'm going to tighten them up. This caused the guy to respond. One fellow responded, and he said he wrote some books, and he said I would be interested in his book. So I ordered his book. He said it is the culmination of his 60 years work. So I figure he's 80s. And I'm like, I really want to hear what this man has to say and what advice he has to offer in terms of interacting with the philosophers, because he is one of them. And he recognized the value of the statement that I sent you. He credited me falsely with the
I don't care who gets the credit. I just want to win.
I know. He's just focused his attention on these verbal representations, it seems.
I mean, this is the thing with psychology, right? They try to remain intuitionistic because they're still using self-reflection instead of operationalization. It's like I say, all the value in psychology is coming out of neuroscience. It's not coming out of psychology.
Yeah, they're kind of stalled.
They're stalled because it's sort of like philosophy, right? I mean, there's only so much introspection you can do without additional knowledge that you can't obtain by introspection. It's just exasperating that we're sitting here still having these debates about classical liberalism or social. No, you run the state, the polity, like a business, which is empirically. You don't practice ideology or philosophy or theology or wishful thinking. There's a purely scientific method of government. So fixing the problem is simple. Fixing the economy, fixing the monetary system, fixing the tax system. These are all simple things once you know the science, but they don't operate in science. They operate on ideology and 18th century philosophy. because they don't want that. They want the philosophizing of it or the theologicalizing of it. They don't want the sciencing of social science, because science demands adaptation. Philosophy says, well, let's just ignore the costs and see if we can weasel our way out of it. And theology says we can ignore it.
Which is kind of a funny thing to talk about lying. It's fascinating because it's like it's seldom discussed, which is bizarre.
That's the problem,
It's just a truly overlooking something mountainous.
It's like, in the church, we're not allowed to talk about sex. In philosophy and morality, we're not allowed to talk about lying. It doesn't mean they don't exist. And yes, it's good that we don't educate ourselves on how to lie, just like we don't want to create obsession with sex or drugs or anything else. But somebody's got to.
It merits some attention.
Most of what we do, all the complexity we see in life, is all the kind of bullshit lying and posturing we do in order to negotiate cooperation. I don't like to bring up Wittgenstein or ever give him any credit, but his term language game is actually really good. It's all language games. Well, that's a nice way of saying that we're all gaming each other for opportunities. Yeah, I want. All right, I want to win my game, my checkers game with you, as everybody else, and so I'm gonna, negotiate all this stuff to try to win my checkers game. But that's all that's going on. The irony of this, the difference between the simplicity of what's really going on and the vast ocean of bullshit that we've invented over the past 10,000 years just absolutely floors me, right? I mean, it's just, we're inventive. We're more inventive in bullshit than we are in anything useful. It's hysterical.
It's funny. I talked to my sister about this. I talked to these guys. I'm talking to the philosophers, and I'm like, so many words. And that's what it comes down to. Just.
And the postmodernists, they're the masters of it. A lot of words that mean nothing. What bothers me about philosophy is it eliminates violence and it eliminates cost. Well, they're what determine fucking everything. The whole point is to increase the cost of violence so we can decrease the cost of goods. What a stupid discipline philosophy is that? It's about feels versus reals. We usually say left feels, right reals. But that turns out to be only partly true. Then you go to the right, though, and you get this problem of the guys start systematizing, but underneath it, they need to feel. You got the spiritual people, which is easy to understand why they need to feel, because they've been indoctrinated into using that sense of feeling, right? You get the passionate, angry males that need to feel. Everything needs to satisfy a feeling. You get the philosophical ones, which it turns out they're just satisfying a feeling. And so the difference is the right seems to be systematizing in order to make excuses for justifying their feelings. But in the end, they're still just feeling. The amount of lying that goes on, and even in federal data, is ridiculous.
God. It appears that there's a reduction to simplification to absurdity for the purpose of broadcasting on social media for outrage potential.
And here we get to we get tied back. I can shit on philosophers again. And it's called Reductio ad absurdum. So it's using an absurdly simple example, which you will intuit is true. It's a form of suggestion. In other words, it's a form of deceit because it's not sufficiently unambiguous that it can't be misinterpreted. So you see this in, of course, philosophy is full of suggestion. My favorite one being the one I bring up all the time, which is the failure of logic to incorporate the requirement for continuous recursive disambiguation, leading to the problem of the verb to be and the problem of the liars and Zeno's paradoxes, all of which are, of course, failures of a basic grammatical rule of continuous recursive disambiguation, which is the rule of the universe. It's just kind of funny to me that all philosophical nonsense is based on violating the first principle of the universe, which is continuous recursive disambiguation. The irony that you could get away with everything in this box, written in this box is a lie, the liar's paradox, that could live this long is just hysterical to me. In retrospect, it's hysterical because it violates the first principle.
That it merits any attention whatsoever, right?
Yeah, it's fucking ridiculous. Or that, what does X mean? That's a really stupid thing. It doesn't mean anything. What do we mean when we say it? It doesn't mean anything. So people mean things and they either can articulate them clearly or they can't. There's either, in some cases, there's a word for it. In other cases, there isn't. Where there isn't a word for it, there must be a story for it. If you can't compose a story for it, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. It's not complicated. So the problem with statistics is they always try to come up with some number that is the most reductive, in other words, reductio ad absurdum. But allows them to engage in suggestion. Well, what's suggestion? Like the verb to be is a form of suggestion. That's a philosophical term.
Authoritative suggestion.
So statistics is like using the verb to be, a reductio absurdum. In any event, so this whole idea of using aggregates is reductio ad absurdum, which is just the sophistry in statistics, like Cantorian mathematics or Bohr's mathematics and physics. These are pseudosciences. They're mathiness. And then you get down into the statistics of what we do in economics, and this is the case. And of course, it's most evident in philosophy because it's most ridiculous. The difference is when we do it in religion, we expect it to be ridiculous. It's okay for stuff to be clownish in mythology. We expect it.
Right.
It's
not.
okay.
It's a cartoon version of not reality. It's
Right. I mean, and that's
expected,
okay because, crayons are useful. Crayon drawings are useful, for kids. But then, you go from crayon sketches to philosophy, which is like the watercolor version. Like there's some watercolors and you're like, oh, wow, this is, I guess you can get away with that. That's like, it's a suggestion of a cloud.
Right. Right.
And then you get to science and it's the photorealist, right? I sat there with a projector or a loop and I made sure that and this mirrors the image as much as the human eye's resolution can tolerate at a distance of 6 feet, right?
Right.
So you get the ends of the spectrum there, but it's just the idea that we can use reductio ad absurdum as a means of a suggestion, right? Because most of our ordinary common languages consists of suggestions in order to save time and effort. But we've built the system of lies across all these disciplines, from religion to philosophy to social science to the hard sciences to mathematics to logic. We've built this all out there as this set of falsehoods that are based on reductio ad absurdums because reductio models are easy to understand. Well, sure they are.
They just don't correspond with reality very well. It's like, just saying.
And the people who say, well, it's just the first step. I'm trying to get you there. But I don't see that. What I see is that most everybody gets to the first step and then is a fucking moron from there on. Right? That just seems to be what they teach in university is how to be a moron by taking for granted an appealing suggestion that's supported only by reductio absurdum examples of statistical construction. In other words, it's just pseudoscience. I would wish people would stop reading philosophy and would just read history and economics. It makes so much more sense.
That was a clue for everybody that's watching.
Philosophy is just fucking...
No, stop it. Stop it.
It's fantasy role-playing.
Oh, LARPing.
It's LARPing. You have pseudoscientists in every field or disciplinary experts who have narrowed their domain to a point where it's a pseudoscience. In other words, it's no longer commensurable with the rest of the
Right.
science.
They're wanking off, man. They're speaking their own language with their own
Yes.
friends and not talking to anybody else.
It's really easy to see how this is spread off into multiple points of failure. This knowledge is why I'm frustrated with the academy, because in my view, they're still living in the 19th century. They don't know it. Even somebody like Dan Dennett, who I don't think is an idiot, I just want to have a debate with him because I don't think he gets it. Daniel Dennett, probably one of our best.
Who is he?
He's a philosopher in California. Look him up, Daniel Dennett. He has a massive beard and belly.
Is it Bennett or Dennett?
Dennett with a D. Like dent in your head. You get there. And you notice I don't put any philosophy in there.
I noticed that. I did notice, though, Nietzsche does qualify as a philosopher, I think.
Well, is it? The Birth of Tragedy is an historical analysis of what, right? Of course, that was the only thing I read. Because I thought that I was reading the rest of them like, this is ridiculous. It sounded very teenage to me, right? Until, you get down, you find these little, if you look at his aphorism, what's that, man? The one where he thinks he's wonderful, I'm the greatest that ever lived, whatever. But his aphorisms, that shit's genius. That's absolutely genius. But his fundamental insight was simply that it's like the fundamental insight of Christianity. The fundamental insight of the Greeks is tragedy. And the fundamental insight of the Indo-Europeans is the primacy of man over nature. The Greeks, the tragedy is a derivation of the primacy of man. Roman law and administration is just Indo-European paternalism. Christianity, however, is the thing that the Middle East provided because aristocratic people can treat They treat common folk as domesticated animals. And so what Christianity did is it allowed those people to join in. So that's why I said, you can see this whole correction of the combination of Christianity, Arianism, and paganism, martial paganism. You can see that sitting out there. And the container that makes it ritualized is Stoicism, because really, how do men deceive? We make up all these incredibly sophisticated methods we call philosophy and theology.
But it's attention-seeking behaviors, right?
Yeah, that's how fictionalisms are the male method of lying. The problem is we're treating it as normal, but it's just the male method because it's been dominant political scale. I mean, the history of philosophy, theology, and ideology, the history of literature is the long history of the male means of power seeking. The argument is that, of course, the Great Depression was caused by the collapse in fertilizer from South America, like we're collapsing fertilizer from Russia today. See, like I talk about, we teach political history it's basically, we're teaching the art of social construction. Does that make sense? When we teach political history, we're teaching the history of social construction. If we teach the history of religion, we're teaching the history of social construction. If we teach the history of philosophy, we're teaching the history of social construction. But if you teach instead the history of technology, economy, and law, you're teaching the bottom up.
Right. What is the substrate upon which it all is constructed?
Right. Then all this social construction is just negotiating for position on top of whatever geography, demographics, economy, and law exist. It's just jockeying for position. So this is why I said all intellectual history that you read is just the art of lying. So this is why I tell people, I don't know why you're studying religion or studying philosophy or even, that much history. If you aren't studying the basics, you're just talking about who's lying about what to get what from somebody else without engaging in trade.
Oh my.
This is why I find people who study philosophy morons. I can forgive people who study religions because it's bullshit, right? And that's okay, fine. But the problem is the people who study philosophy don't know it's fucking the same kind of bullshit.
They don't know?
No, I think that you should, how seriously people who study philosophy to take it. I mean, there's a German philosopher trying to make a name for himself. I just want to put out a series of videos and eviscerate the guy. And I'm not cruel enough to do that.
So I want you to know the name that I'm calling this video. I'm calling it Realism versus Social Constructionism. That's what I'm going to call this video.
Well, you can just call it smart people versus morons.
Oh my.
Which is really what it means.
Oh my.
Here's the thing. Well, religious literature is children's literature. Philosophy is young adult literature. And it's a lot easier to learn mythology than it is philosophy because the burden is on only intuition, whereas now you're raising it to reason. But once you have to raise it from reason to empiricism, to evidence, it falsifies it. What you're talking about is a declining reliance on intuition.
It's awful.
I want to believe my feelings because it's a neural economy. And I don't want to adapt, right?
So much work, man.
It's fucking hard. So, you look at this and it's like, well, then why is there imitative ethics, heroic ethics, like Christian ethics or Jewish ethics or Muslim ethics or Buddhist ethics? You're trying to imitate a hero. So why is there imitative ethics? It's because it's easy for children. Why is there philosophical or rational or virtue ethics? Because you're trying to develop a set of rules. Well, the rules are easier than instinct. And then you're trying to get into outcome ethics. So there's no difference. It's just children's stories, young adult stories, and adult stories, or intuitionistic stories, rational stories, and empirical stories, or how I feel in the present stories, how I'm going to predict my actions in the future stories, or what are the outcome stories. But it's all before, during, and after. It's some scale. And these are just some spectrum of adaptive learning. So the problem is how many of us can learn basic science, basic geography, basic demographics, basic economics, and basic law?
Not many. That's a lot. It's a lot
There's
of
only
layers.
so many of us can do that and still test it. Because how do you test what you feel? Well, you feel it. How do you test what you reason? Well, you reason it. How do you test stuff that's really dependent on facts? It's hard because you need a lot of general knowledge. Of course, the Middle East developed fictionalism. It's obviously to develop that. The fucking IQ of the population is like 83 today. God knows what it was 4,000 years ago, 5,000, 6,000 years ago, right? Of course they developed fictionalism. It's the closest, most primitive thing. Why did the Chinese develop wisdom instead? Well, it's because their language is pretty poor for the kind of thought they were doing. Why did the Greeks develop idealism? Because our language is an action-oriented language. It's based in realism because it's martial. The Greeks did idealism, which is there's a set of ideal forms in the universe, like recipes or prescriptions or architectural models by which the world has to conform. This isn't actually too far off, but what did we have to do, beginning with Aristotle, Democritus, and Epicurus, is we tried to get from idealism to realism. So Plato is continuing the storytelling, what we call literary tradition, which I think of as the mid-wit tradition. And Aristotle, Epicurus, and Archimedes, and really the pre-Socratics, they're developing the other direction, which is it's decidable rather than it's influenceable. It's judicial rather than educational or coercive. When you're saying ideal, you might want to say literary or verbal rather than material, verbal rather than physical, because that's technically idealism. But I keep telling people, I really feel like studying essays and history and philosophy, and it's all bullshit people wrote. But if you go out and you study law and economics and military activity and geography, it's a very different world out there. It's a rough and tumble world out there. But if you read scripture and theology and philosophy and essays and history, it's all warm and fuzzy, or it's bitching about somebody else. So last time we talked about what's the first question of philosophy, personal philosophy, why don't I commit suicide? What's the second question of philosophy? Why didn't I kill you and take your stuff? I just think these are funny as hell. Why don't I and mine kill you and yours and take your stuff? Politics. And the fourth question is how do we organize our people? That's group evolutionary strategy. And what are the limits of tolerance? And that's the limits. And so you have to answer those 5 questions because otherwise you're starting with a presumption rather than a first principle. I'm watching Curtis Yarvin and Mencius Moldbug try to move back from CEO to public intellectual. And I really like this guy, but he's just another literary, But the thing is, people listen to the literary philosophers because it's a pseudoscientific version of moralizing, which is what all history is. It's what all philosophy is. It's just pseudoscientific moralizing. It's not bad, but it's just mostly fantasy moral literature. Then I go over to the next step and we get Lindsay, who's not writing fantasy moral literature, but he is doing literary criticism. And the thing is, he's being successful because he's using literary criticism. But it's really hard to go from criticism you agree with. It's like libertarians' false promise of, the non-aggression, but it doesn't mean anything unless you know aggression against what. And then how do we manage that? Well, so Lindsay's doing a great job of literary criticism. He's showing what's wrong with the thing. But that allows each audience member to still feel that his feelings about what we should do are legitimate. So it's like the half-truth. The half-truth of it is criticism. It allows everybody out there to think they agree. Well, they agree with the criticism, but that doesn't mean they agree with the solution. Now take the next step to us. We're doing the science. We're saying what the solution is. This solution then doesn't just say, here, you agree with me because I'm criticizing your enemy. It says, here's what we would do about it. And it's not easy like sitting back, relaxing, and listening to literary critique, or sitting back, relaxing to storytelling. I don't want to criticize Yarvin because I've done enough work to say this is what he's doing. He's just doing mythologizing. And our good friend James Lindsay is doing literary critique. But the minute you get to saying, okay, what to do about it, you're actually allowing people to have criticism of the solution of you, right? Yep. And you're also opening the doors for the fact that, they can always all agree on how to criticize the enemy. They can't agree on what to do about it. And so that's the problem we face, is that we're saying, here's the solution, here's what it is, it's scientific, and worst of all, it's not empathic. In other words, it's purely rational and scientific. And worse, we're saying some of the things you actually might believe in, because everybody's a little bit at fault here, are going to go out the window too. And so it's a very adult thing we're doing. And these other things aren't really that adult.
They're less adult.
They're less adult.
It goes like this: the issue is some having further conversations with Dr. Enriquez's group. And those guys they're having some very weird conversations about God and just mythological conversations, just highly inflated in tone.
They're doing fantasy moral literature. They're doing LARPing.
Yeah, but see, they have me in there with them. And so it's like this. So I bring it back to science, and then they're left to reflect upon that, because they're not wrong, but they're just talking in inflated terminology.
Okay, so how does that mean?
The conversation will evolve towards operationalism. That's where it will evolve to, because it has no other way to go. Because ultimately what's happening is the pressure is forcing the resolution of the crisis as the pressure increases, and the solutions have to be operational.
Oh, I see. So they can talk about all the ideas they want. Those are discursive fantasies, but the minute you have to talk about what are we actually going to do here, you have to bring them down to
Right. So they get to sit back in the faculty lounge, smoking pipes and drinking whatever they're drinking, tea, I suppose, and having good old chuckles and shooting the breeze, because they're not under pressure yet. So until that time, offer them operational language and allow them to understand what that you understand. So they recognize that you're a column standing, holding the roof up, and they will gravitate towards that because it's the column that offers the support.
I don't know, dude. That might be true. What I find is it's a great filter, is that the vast majority of people are interested in these subjects precisely because they're LARPing. In other words, it's a form of entertainment. That's all it is.
That's because they're not under enough pressure yet.
Right. And so what happens is the serious guys, they're all the same personality, and they're just actually intellectually honest.
And dutiful.
And dutiful. And so what happens to these other guys is they just go somewhere where they can LARP some more, because it's just video games for them. Most of these people in these discourses are playing video games. And what they like is playing the video game. They don't actually want to do any work. There's a tendency for people on the right to fall into the three groups. And it's normal because we all follow what has the greatest number of associations for us, because that's the least neural cost.
Right.
So we tend to build upon whatever foundations we find. Now, we know that theological basis is based on indoctrination. We know that the philosophical basis is largely based on self-learning. And we know the scientific basis is based largely on formal education. And so this is sort of like saying, what kind of fiction books do you like to read? Mystery or science? It's the same kind of thing where you tend to learn a paradigm and you like to work within whatever emotes you the most because of its associations. So because of that, you have the sciencey guys like us, the philosophy guys, and the religious guys. And there's also the ideology guys. And ideology is, in formal sense, means under democracy, it became possible to shortcut the rigor of theology and philosophy and merely appeal to motivate people toward an end under democracy. That's what an ideology means. So this falls into the 5 questions, philosophy. What's the first question of philosophy? Why don't commit suicide? Well, we call that personal philosophy. Why don't you commit suicide? Well, it's a really interesting question because we don't. Why don't we? I mean, it makes no sense. Why would we stay? People say it's instinct, but what is that instinct?
It goes to the why did the chicken cross the road question. And I have the answer to that. That's different than what you might imagine. It is a psychological question, right? Why did the chicken cross the road?
I'm afraid it's opportunity. The second question is, well, once I've dealt with the question of personal philosophy, I'm always trying to acquire something. It might just be life, it might be time, it might be feelings, who knows, but you're trying to acquire something. And they hate that. They can't stand the fact that all behavior is reducible to acquisition, because that means that all behaviors are reducible to self-interest. And that most of what they're doing is they're investing heavily in others for the purpose of advancing their self-interest. They just like the fact that by mutual investment in others and the mutual pursuit of self-interest, they do find the fact that they've created more opportunities. So the second question is, why engage in cooperation rather than free-riding parasitism and predation? Well, it's because many hands make light work. It's the opportunity to acquire more. Besides, other people tend to do nasty things to you, like kill you and flay your skin and make things like skull pyramids. The third question is, so this is you in relation to others. This is your group. Why engage in cooperation with others rather than free riding parasitism and predation? It's a question of politics. The answer is the opportunity to acquire more and greater safety. To acquire more and greater safety. To acquire more and greater safety.
Right, and there's loss prevention in there as well. It's opportunity to acquire and prevent loss.
The fourth question group asked to answer is how should we organize our people with myths, arguments, and rules to survive and prosper in competition from nature and man? That's our group evolutionary strategy. So why do we do that? The opportunity to acquire and greater safety at less neural cost. And the last question group had, what are the limits of tolerance for life? In other words, philosophy, for ethics, others, for politics, and for group evolutionary strategy before we resort to suicide, separation, free riding, parasitism, predation, and condition of victimhood. That is the question of limits, what I call defection or reciprocity within the limits of proportionality. And of course, the answer to all five of these questions is the persistence of opportunities of existence, of returns on cooperation, and the returns on the production of commons are preferable to suicide, separation, free riding, parasitism, predation, and the condition of victimhood. Conversely, resistance, violence, feud, insurrection, revolution, civil war, warfare, and genocide are preferable to submission to undermining of that cooperation, our hindering of cooperation, parasitism, and predation. So we organize, to make this easier, we organize individual, organizing by ethics, organizing by politics, organizing by group evolution history, all within limits. And so the problem is we think theology and philosophy are what matter. They just justify whatever we do, and whatever we do is in our law.
Yeah, the law is the actual formative agent. The other two bolster it and substantiate it and justify it, essentially.
Philosophy is really an appeal by the middle class to change the law. That's what it really consists of, to change the way we are adjudicating law. Really, and law has to exist because it's empirical. You have a real economic circumstance with real people having real problems. And as cooperation increases, you have this invention of this thing we call law to make it possible for the increase of scale of cooperation. But then we get theology and philosophy and ideology as means of trying to change that system in favor of one direction or another. People still fight Darwin. As a matter of fact, you can see the entire post-war method as fighting Darwin. I think they're going to fight me just like they fought Darwin for the same reason.
That's okay. So maybe the case study is to study how they fought Darwin and lost.
Well, I mean, that's my point is they didn't lose. Darwin didn't win. I mean, if you look at what's going on, all of this is anti-Darwin. I mean, this is just like the French reacted to the English with Voltaire and Rousseau, and just like Kant and the German phenomenalists reacted to both Rousseau and the English, and just as the communists reformed Hegel against the Germans and the fascists reformed against the communists, everybody tries to cheat Mother Nature until they have no choice. We found out Hobbes was right. That's not a nice thing.
Sorry.
Hobbes was right. Oh my.
We found out that Darwin was right. Sorry. We found out that Spencer was right. Sorry. We found out that Nietzsche was right. Sorry. Doolittle's right. Sorry. One of the things you hear in philosophy is try to bring up the principle of non-contradiction and that an argument has to be provable by its own criteria. Well, that's a fucking stupid statement because there's no closure. The only appeal to closure was outside of the argument. In other words, until you get to fully testing every dimension that's possible for humans to test, you haven't got to the point where the information in the system is sufficient to make a judgment. Basically, it's just a robot. I mean, I would say that's the difference between sentient and not, is respect for property. I mean, that's probably the best demarcation we have.
That's Hoppe.
That's Hoppe. I agree. Yeah.
To be sentient is to be capable of immorality.
This is way too much like philosophy.
That's Peterson.
That's Peterson. So Camus asks a question. What is philosophy? Paradigm choice. The light version, decidability. It's not based on first principles. It's just based on a paradigm. Permits or justifies. What is the first question philosophy. This is Camus being a freaking genius.
What's the first question of philosophy? Oh, why don't you kill ourselves? Like that, I'm like,
So this is the importance of first principles. Because if you don't answer that question, you're able to come up with all sorts of bullshit. I used to get into well, how do I know I'm not a brain in a vat? I'll tell you why. I'm going to give you a 45. I'm going to put it to your head. And if you believe you're a brain in a vat, you'll pull the trigger. If you don't, then you don't believe you're a brain in a vat. And so that's called a demonstrated reference. Whereas a brain in a vat is a justification. So how do we know that anything exists? By action. So what is the first question of philosophy? Well, it's suicide. And it's so important because if you can't make that decision, you can't answer any subsequent questions. Anyway, the first question is why not commit suicide? That's personal philosophy. The second is why. I say this more kindly here. I don't say, why should I kill you and take your stuff? This is in proper prose.
as opposed to it's merely implied.
The third question is why engage in cooperation, right? And that's politics. The fourth and the fifth questions is how should we organize our people with myths, arguments, and rules to survive and prosper in competition with nature and man? That's group evolutionary strategy. And the fifth question a group must answer is what are the limits of tolerance for personal philosophy, life, ethics, politics, and group evolutionary strategy before we resort to suicide, separation, free riding, parasitism, predation, and the condition of victimhood? That question is of limits. So we have to preserve state, avoid cost, and acquire gains. We can cooperate, we can avoid, we can conflict, but when is cooperation, avoidance, or conflict rational? And these are the answers. The answer to all five questions is that the persistence of opportunities for existence, the returns on cooperation, returns on the production of commons are preferable to suicide, separation, free riding, parasitism, predation, victimhood.
Oh my.
And conversely, resistance, violence, feud, insurrection, revolution, civil war, warfare, and genocide are preferable to submission to the undermining of our cooperation, hindering our cooperation, and parasitism and predation. So I try to start with the first principle, not the presumption of the goodness. So most people start with the presumption of goodness, and they never acknowledge why, which allows you to create all these lovely fantasies. When in fact, if you understand the via negativa, what we're seeking to avoid, then you can come up with the limits to cooperation. And so one of the things I'm trying to cover here is that there is a limit to the point at which anyone, an individual, a family, a clan, a tribe, a nation, or any organization, a family, a corporation, a state, or a civilization, there's a limit to the value of cooperation. There's a limit to the value of even trying to cooperate. That limit isn't difficult to calculate. The question is essentially, what is the point of defection within? And what is the point of retaliation without? And so the cost of retraining is really high on people who already have a tendency to fit. They already have a theological, philosophical, ideological, pseudoscientific, or sophomoric frame that they're reliant on as a pretense of knowledge. And retraining people, like taking people back to kindergarten or grade school, is fucking hard, especially when they're hyper invested in it, especially if they're older.
So maybe we just have to grow a bunch instead of try to find them and retrain them.
Very reasonable philosophy. It makes a whole lot of sense. Basically, all Chinese thought makes good sense. It just does. We're a big extended family. It's patriarchy, right? We all have our narrow responsibilities, and dad's responsible for that, and then the men above them are responsible, and the emperor's responsible, the party chief, whatever the fuck he is. It's completely reasonable. Then you get down to the fact that you've got like philosophy, ideology, because philosophy, as we understand that term, we generalize it because we don't know how to call Chinese philosophy something else, or Hindu philosophy something else.
Yeah, we don't have proper terminology for it. We haven't disambiguated it well enough.
These things aren't actually equal.
No.
Because the problem is that Western philosophy and Chinese Confucianism, they're really religions. They're at least semi-rational, certainly reasonable equivalents of religion. But you can actually argue against philosophy. It's not dependent on faith.
It's not authoritarian.
That's the great utility of it is it preserves the adversarial marketplace, competing ideas. So traditionally what we've done is we've discovered something new through a practice of life. And Western philosophy has tried to write an appeal from generally the middle class, which is where most philosophers come from, upper middle class, right? They write an appeal in the form of philosophy to the world, right? Essentially to the authorities, as an advice on how to reorganize our understanding of the world. In other words, it's just reorganizing. We've added new names, we've created new categories, and reorganized it. And so there's this little cooperation between science, technology, markets, law, and philosophy in this beautiful cycle that goes around. And our group strategy stays constant. Our religion stays relatively constant. Our philosophy changes relatively periodically. And our markets and laws and technologies and sciences, they change constantly. I know humans, we invent great stuff, really. I mean, if you don't look at it like I need to believe or find, you just look at it as look at it as art.
Oh, okay.
I look at it as art.
Social art.
Yeah, I look at it as social art.
Okay.
And so when you look at religions and philosophies, is social art. It's just the aesthetics that are in those things. That's the way to do it. Is you don't look at it like it's right or wrong. You look at it as like you would literature or sculpture or architecture or the play. Easy one is the play because it's so close to go from the play to philosophy. That transition is really easy. It's a little bit easy to go from the play to sculpture, from sculpture to painting, and sculpture and painting to architecture. You can sort of get all that. That sort of makes sense. But if you just look at, remember, my first training is in art. My formal training is in art theory. So I don't really distinguish like between philosophies and arts. And sort of government's sort of in there somewhere, like along the same.
It's a cognitive art form.
Yeah, right. So when you look at these religions, it's arts. So what we're experiencing at present, of course, is that we tend to think of it as moving from state to state.
Wait, that means condition to condition. Is that
condition
correct?
to condition.
Okay.
So from agrarianism to industrialism, from industrialism to technology. This is sort of like we move from hunter-gatherer to agrarianism. We're thinking about it as this step, but that's not really true. We're moving from stagnant to adaptive. We're moving from one time frame to another. And if you want to listen to Dugin, that's his real complaint. Underneath what Dugin's saying is he can't bear the fact that we're moving from continuity and experience, what he calls the Hegelian, Dasein, whatever. He doesn't want us to move from experiencing the feminine to adapting the masculine. But if you look at what he's saying, that's just what Heidegger was. This is what all these guys say. They're just saying, I want the past, where we were ignorant.
It was so much easier being
right. So they're all just Luddites. Thinking we're moving from static plane to static plane is part of the agrarian, the theological and philosophical pursuit of stagnation, rather than the empirical pursuit of continuous recursive evolution and adaptation. So they're actually seeking poverty, but what they mean is they want neural parsimony and neural economy. So my argument is that we have developed institutions that would distribute responsibility in the hierarchy by reciprocal care of each class.
Yes.
But equality, which is again a theological and philosophical, not empirical argument, the theological and the philosophical, not the empirical, seek for uniformity rather than hierarchy, where the hierarchy isn't power, it's responsibility. And so we had that figured out and we fucked it up with.
Wait a minute. Whoa. Wait. Okay.
Brad,
wait. I have to tell this story.
Brad?
Wait. Okay. I'm obligated to tell this story because it's a local story. Okay. So it's like the Lone Ranger and Tonto are surrounded by a bunch of locals, which is the Apache tribe down by, oh my, it goes like this. It's like this. So Lone Ranger asks Tonto, he says, Tonto, what are we going to do? What do you mean, we, white man? Now you can go, Curt. We're back to Dugin, who called himself a Bolshevik, and it really upset me. I'm like, I can't even talk to you anymore. I took you seriously up to that point. He's called himself a Bolshevik. I couldn't tolerate it.
I've begun to understand him as it sounds like he's using philosophy, but he's using theology. I really do have begun to understand him quite well. Reading Ilian helped me a lot because that's where it's all coming from. I read Heidegger and I see an ass clown. I read Hegel and I see a well-meaning ass clown. And I read Kant, an aspy ass clown. But they're all ass clowns. You finally get to Nietzsche and he can't get it across the line because, of course, he's going insane. But that whole Continental stuff, it's just how do we cover the spectrum of ass clownage is European philosophy. It's a grammar of children's stories. It works. Philosophy is a grammar of adult stories.
Okay.
And science is a grammar of elite
Technicians.
stories. This is just a graceful increase in precision and a graceful decrease in precision.
Yeah.
Now, the decrease in precision can be handled by two methods. One is I either have the information to work at the scientific or the rational or the theological or not. When all else fails, you go to the theological. If you have enough information to make it rational, you make it rational. If you have enough information that's scientific, you make it scientific. The argument I always use is no general gets shot for falling back on biblical morality if he has to make a hard choice in the absence of knowledge. In other words, if under pressure, the absence of knowledge, do the right thing. This is why the trolley test doesn't matter. So the second direction is that your age. It's just the same argument. If you're young and not educated, empathic, it's enough because your sphere of influence is only the people you interact with. Now I'm working in the greater social world or the economic world. And now I have to obey moral and ethical norms and rules and traditions, which I have to explicitly understand. And so I have to reason through because now it's not what do we share, it's what do we have that's different.
That's right. Now we're in a marketplace.
Now we're in a marketplace and now we got to not deal with what we share.
Marketplace ethics.
Marketplace ethics. And that's rational. And so you go from the child to the young adult.
So it's social influence increasing requires increased precision of language and
we differ.
information.
And why do we have political systems? Because we can't organize by market need. So you have science and law is essentially science of decidability, reciprocity, etc. That's for political scale. And so these are just
so it comes to decidability as to how do I decide what to do?
Christian among your peers, Kantian in your commerce, and Smithian in your politics. The reason is you can't know anymore. You can't know what other people want at the political level.
Comrade.
It doesn't matter. So you generate this need for essentially what we consider contractual thought and the negotiation of contracts, which keeps you in basically the material world. So the English develop what we call in philosophy analytic thinking. I would just call it empirical thinking. Yeah. And I would call the philosophical interpretation of judicial, legal, and empirical thinking as analytic. In other words, the analytic philosophy tends to be more about interpretation of language and text, which is somewhat like what happened in Greece. But what you see that happens in the French, who are second, it happens with the French, then the Germans, then the Jews. But the understandable change is from scientific to rationalist. Somebody asked about that today, and I said, well, think of Kant and Hegel versus Smith and Hume. Now, Kant and Hegel are both trying to create the same experience of theology in rational terms. They're trying to rigorously migrate to philosophical form what is essentially a theological morality experience. And the most important thing is that in the Anglos, they completely demarcated, disambiguated is the right word, observable thought, in other words, empirical thought from philosophical thought, from theological thought. Just as most of what we call philosophy is really the intersection of observables and theology or mythology, the analytic philosophy that arises out of this is really saying, how do I create what's empirically moral? And you get that really with Smith. You could argue that other people have it, and you get what essentially is psychology from Hume. But what you lose in the process is that religion is highly binding for a social group, specifically because it's emotional, psychological, and pro-social. What you get in philosophy is you get to a smaller group of people who can interpret this bridge, which is a rational interpretation doing the same thing, trying to maintain a social or experiential method of thought. So when you read Continental philosophy, just like the German language differs from the English, is that it has this, they call it phenomenalistic, but there's really an emotional component. They don't divorce the experience of being human from the observables. And so you get this sort of odd bridge where Anglos have completely disambiguated each category of experience, religious, rational, and empirical, to produce what is a method of thought for a ruling class, just like the Greeks produced a method of thought for a ruling class. In this sense, the Germans were producing it for more of a majority middle class. If you look at the French then, so the thing is though, is that the Germans are the beautiful intersection. And this is why I say we've got to study the Germans, is because they actually get really close to being right a lot, and they still keep the phenomenal in there. So you have the ability to be bound, at least socially bound in the middle class, rationalist philosophy, and this can percolate downward. And then you can retain your theology for the working classes. Then you have the French come along, and they're, of course, authoritarian, feminine. So what's happening here is each civilization, the Anglo and the German, is just preserving its perception of the utility of popular thought related to a class and its method of speaking, right? Governance. So you really have Anglo-empiricism, German Protestantism, and French Catholicism coming out. And so the French just they take the superstition out of the moral license, but they don't put in the German rationalism or the Anglo observabilism, empiricism. They don't put in either one. And so what you get is this really interesting progress through the classes. And, when I say, what's the relationship between the aristocracy and the peasantry in group evolutionary strategy, you're seeing this play out. You're seeing this play out in the spread of the counter-revolution against Anglo-empiricism. Why is it that Anglos maintain social cohesion? This is very important. The Germans maintain social cohesion, the French maintain social cohesion, and the Ashkenazi Jews maintain social cohesion using these different methods. So if you get to the Jews, they're basically an underclass. They're treated as one or a separate class. And so they come out first with the reform of their law, which is Mendelssohn. And then they later come out with the Marxist revolution. So they come out with class revolutions. Within their own system, they come out with a legal or rabbinical reform. And later they come out with a peasant reform or Marxism, underclass reform, which is fascinating. So what I did here was I tried to map out this spectrum, even though the order is Anglo, French, German, Jewish. Just as the spread of modernity moved from England across into Germany, from Germany into Eastern Europe, and finally it began to take root in Russia. And of course, that completion of that process collapsed. So anyway, you have Anglos who are a naval civilization. Because they're naval and traders, they tend to be universalist. We tend to have a broader concept of what norms, traditions, values, etc. should be, because we have to interact with a lot of people. The method ended up being empirical or scientific. We tend to say to people, you've made an error or you're wrong, or that's an error. So it's a via negativa sort of way of the work.
So it's an error correcting.
It's error correcting. And that's important because it's actually value neutral, which is part of this and this, right? So this construct produces this construct, which encourages trade, which produces this construct, which produces negotiations along these terms, which leads to a political order that's, again, contractual in those terms. And since contractualism produces egalitarianism, the problem is that if it brought to an extent, it's suicidal.
I don't understand this. So the result is suicidal.
Because you expand to the point, the Jews did it. You expand your interest to the point of maximization of your opportunities for collective private consumption at the expense of the preservation of commons that give you a homeland, etc. So the Jews did it too much, and they eventually became diasporic. The English have done it and became diasporic, but this ethic we have is the same vulnerability you see in Americans. What happened is the Jewish diaspora came here with race Marxism. They took advantage of amplifying that neutrality.
That's why you call it suicidal, because it's insufficiently self-defensive.
It's insufficiently nationalistic. Well, the Germans have a very interesting view. They're, of course, a landed. They feel defensive. Their attitudes were surrounded on all sides. They are. Instead of being scientific, they were rationalist. Why? Because they could maintain the balance between morality and empiricism, because they had a higher concern for group cohesion, because they were a defensive land culture instead of a universal naval trading culture. I've tried to point out how this is all logically related to the needs of the group given their circumstances. Their organization is what we call social democratic, but it's balanced. They really still have an aristocracy. The aristocracy is interwoven with the government, and so they maintained those aristocratic relations. In other words, Germans looked at Angela Merkel as most people would look at a king. She's in charge. She knows what she's doing. She's done pretty well. This class structure thing has still retained. The result was that they've become hyper competitive. It's like every time the Germans decide they want to do something, they're really fucking good at it. It's for all those reasons. They chose philosophy instead of science and empiricism. In other words, they went from religion to philosophy, and they maintained the relationship between empiricism, factual empiricism, individualism, and the social and emotional and psychological needs of philosophy and religion. It's very interesting. And a lot of their authors started out being from religious. The French, urban society, they were reactionary. They're trying to overthrow the aristocracy. They killed their middle class with a purge. Then they killed their aristocracy. So they produced,
It's just like such an awful story. The whole story is just a tragedy.
That's what
romantic tragedy, right?
France is the origin of bad ideas. That's what they do. It's like women. So they're Rousseauian. They became moralists, experiential. Rousseau's a fucking pervert. He's a very bad human being, but they just bought into that nonsense. And it's utopian moralist. This is rationalist, this is pragmatic, and this is purely scientific, commercial. So what we're seeing here is a sociality question. Look at this content. So we're looking for factual errors among trade, where trade is the culture itself. We're finding a balance in order to maintain sufficient social, moral. They're trying to create the Bible, the equivalent of the Bible in philosophy.
To maintain group cohesion, to have a proper defensive structure and competitive capacity.
But how do the French deal? They did it with ridiculing, the justification and ridicule, and it's very feminine authoritarian. It's the motherly, not paternalistic, it's maternalistic. It's not paternalistic in the sense that I'm trying to produce these things. It's maternalistic, and it's trying to produce these things. These people, we sort of got the absolute nuclear family, they got the nuclear family, they got the traditional family, and they got the pre-family. Because, I mean, Jews didn't become monogamous until after 1500, I think. I mean, the Irish became monogamous in the early 1800s. That happens when the family has enough property and is normatively accepted well enough to become your insurer, because the community has become an insurers. But over here with the Jews, they had a community so strong that insured all its members. This puts less pressure on the family itself and more pressure on the community. But it's also not landed. So whereas these people have that landed aspect, these people have the unlanded. And so these people produce commons, which are material, and these people produce commons, which are emotional and psychological. This is why they get in trouble all the time. So the French method of persuasion was literary, and the result was devolution. In other words, they have a secular version of church rule in France, whereas the Germans transitioned from church to secular rule, basically aristocratic rather than authoritarian. And they did that by developing a system of argument that facilitated it while retaining the social cohesion of it. And the Anglos, I mean, really our social was basically the monarchy and culture and trade. When people come to America, I try to explain to them, well, the reason we're like this is because the American culture is based on trade, commerce. It's not based on religion. or that kind of identity. And that's what we have in common is commerce. So when you say people talk to each other as if we're all customers, that's because that's what good nature is in our culture, is treating each other as customers, because our culture is fundamentally commercial. And the Jews, of course, they went from being the people who were stuck out on the fringes, the people who could finally form a weak monarchy for a while, who were eventually not able to produce commons sufficient to hold themselves. And if they had just said, okay, we'll sacrifice to the emperor, that's fine. They just wouldn't do it. And so they had to go to his diasporic people. Their objective is to produce a world that's safe for a diasporic subset of Jews. Their method eventually moved from a theological to moral, legal, and now it's pseudoscientific. With Marx, they become pseudoscientific. And so that's why I have this big list of the Jews and their European equivalent. And the Europeans are always using empiricism, and the Jewish are always using pseudoscience. Their method of argument is undermining or deception. Baiting into hazard is really the feminine technique of baiting into hazard. They're the authors of positive law, and they managed to get positive law into France. So the positive law is going this way, and the common law is going this way. Again, what they do is they undermine the host population, and they do it under plausible deniability. Their result is the destruction of the host population. They're able to do this through mass production of the popular press, popular authors. So if I go for masculine libertarian, we go this way. And if I go for masculine right, the authoritarian, we go from a German this way. And if we go feminine, we go the opposite direction. So this ends up being our triangle, right? The top of the triangle, the right of the triangle, the middle of the base of the triangle, the left of the triangle. So the reason I have this is that people hear me talk about the current crisis, but we went through the Anglo crisis, the French crisis, the German crisis, the Jewish crisis. We're in the Chinese Muslim crisis, and it looks like Modi is bringing back the Indian crisis. So what's happening is this problem, just like Greek reason, this Anglo-empiricism, rule of law, the modern state, individual responsibility, commercial majoritarianism, that's working its way across the planet, just like bronze did, just like iron did, just like shipping did, boats, just like the spread of Anglo-empiricism did across to Germanic, to Slavic, to Russian. And this, it's sort of like, just like the Bronze Age exploded out of Mesopotamia, modernity sprouted out of what I would say Lotharingia, which is northern France, Germany, the Netherlands, and England. And what happened is that Lotharingian Enlightenment, which is the commercial restoration of natural relations within the European peoples because of their territory, that exploded across the world, and we're still dealing with it. So the fact that I'm picking on the Jews a lot is just because we've already picked on the Germans, we've already picked on the French, we've already picked on the communists, and the difference was they were outside, but the Jews are inside. So the problem is, if they were doing their methods from Israel, it wouldn't matter. It would just be like China or whatever. And Jews in Israel are allies, right? It's the same thing. It's commercial technological culture that values high education. But they're really bad at commons production because they believe silly things. Then what we have, because the Jews are here in the West and they're using the same means of sedition by false promises and pseudoscience or the feminine method, we're sort of stuck here because we've developed this thing and we gave our women the ability to become enfranchised, assuming they'd maintain European feminine ethics. And what happened was the Jews came in with their false promise and it didn't work on our men. They tried to, but it didn't. But what happened was once they switched from class Marxism to race Marxism to sex Marxism to cultural Marxism, women bought in. And since women became the dominant population of the academy and all the non-sciences, meaning gut courses, they're basically going to church for indoctrination into the Jewish method of insurrection. So if you want me to go back in history and talk about the English did wrong, the French did wrong, the Germans did wrong, the Russians did wrong, the Chinese did wrong, the Indians did wrong, I can go through every fucking culture and tell you whichever ones are wrong. But they're not the problem of the moment. The problem of the moment is the unification of Jewish introgression and female bias because we hadn't sufficiently protected against female means of criminality, social superpredation, and undermining and treason and sedition. We hadn't defended against it because the introgression came at the same time as we liberated our women to be able to participate in economy and polity. But in the vernacular, in the philosophical mathematical realism means its opposite. it means mathematical Platonism. It's just,
That's why I say hanging out with you guys is kind of hard.
it's like this philosophy's created all these landmines of stupidity because of all this stuff, and you can't get out of it. And then there's so many quote philosophers that are just rearranging the ingredients in the pot and calling it novel. It's like operationalism, programming, logic, sets, rationalism, and dialectic. This is just a spectrum of increasing knowledge. You can only speak about operationalism if you have the knowledge. You can only speak in set theories if you have some knowledge of what sets are. You can formalize. You can only speak in rationalist terms like Kant if you can create a rigorous framework. And then if you're in ordinary discourse, debating discourse, dialectic, then it means it's just arbitrary with whatever you have. There's no consistency correspondence. There's no dimensions of correspond to reality in it, except whatever shit you have to work with. That's why I keep saying, don't talk to me about dialectic as if it's something magical. It just means pill pull. It just means you're divorced from reality, because you're seeking consent or agreement with the knowledge you have at your disposal. You're not seeking consistency correspondence to reality, which forces us to adapt to that reality, take advantage of it. It was a great video. I watched it. It finally came out yesterday with Bernardo Kastrup, who was a fucking psychological lunatic. He was a fucking idiot. And Sabine Hassenfelder, and she's like being really kind to him when she should have mopped the floor with him and put his career to end forever. I would have put his career to end because I would have taken it from philosophy to law. And then I would have positioned him as a criminal, which nobody likes, of course, but it was the correct answer. But this guy is someone who's had mental illness problems his whole life, and he's open about it. And so he's looking for something that doesn't require him to have agency. And so he's smart enough to create sophistries all day long. And he's got a need for somehow to be this supernatural agency in the universe. So all this stuff is coming into it, and it's so obvious. You don't use wisdom as if it's logic. You don't use philosophy as if it's science. The difference is how many deductions can you make from a wisdom literature, from a philosophical statement, from a scientific statement, and from a mathematical statement. You can make a lot of deductions from a mathematical description because that's its fucking purpose, right? With science, you can make quite a few second order, third order, fourth order deductions from a scientific rule, right? I mean, we do lots of them. From philosophy, you can sort of build a model that you can make decisions from. But wisdom literature isn't structured to depend on your reason. It's structured to depend on your intuition. So you can't make these second and third order derivations from it. And the second piece I'm doing is why philosophy is over.
So the thing I recognize here is that it's like finally my head is wrapped around the inevitable consequence of our conversations, which is Curt has no intention of being more reasonable. It's like he's not trying to appear to be reasonable. He's just showing you how the reasoning works, and that's okay.
So Darwin was arguably the last philosopher. And after Darwin, philosophy was over. I think that's relatively, I can't remember who said it, but it's probably true. But, Darwin caused a lot of consternation in the world. Remember when I say that we went from the via positiva to the via negativa logic over time? So as you scale up, you reach the point of diminishing returns on via positiva because you've exhausted that level of precision at human scale. But once you pass human scale, you're into science. You are beyond human perception. And once you're beyond human perception, the problem isn't organization, it's falsification. And so in our history, we reached that point somewhere in the 1800s. We got to that conclusion in the 1800s. So in that sense, philosophy as a justificationary movement ended with Darwin because it ended its ability to rely on human sense, perception, and reason at human scale for anything valuable. And so you saw science sort of take over. Now, I have to explain all that in some greater detail because I'll hear every fucking idiot in the world try to disagree with me, especially a bunch of people who've invested their careers in a thing that's now as dead as theology was after Darwin. So we're going to end just like we ended theology with the empirical to Darwinian revolution, we've ended philosophy with the Darwinian to whatever you want to call my work revolution. And so philosophy is over. Now, is that really true? Well, depends on what you think philosophy consists of. Basically, philosophers make 4 claims. The first claim is that philosophy provides the ability to discourse about incommensurable things. So philosophy helps us reach commensurability and discourse. They say that philosophy addresses logic, that philosophy works on truth and morality. So I'm going to argue that pretty obviously that all 4 of those claims are false, that they failed at all 4 of those, and that science has succeeded at all 4 of those, at discourse, which commensurability, logic, truth, and morality. So I'm claiming we've made a leap, and that leap is the same as from the verbal to the operational, which is how I look at the word operational, as from the human scale to the post-human scale. And so my argument is that those 4 claims are false. These 4 claims are false, and that's reducible to the end of the possibility of justification, which is dependent on underlying variation, in other words, metaphysical differences or metaphysical uncertainty. In other words, it's based on this human scale and the unknown, whereas none of those factors are unknown anymore. In other words, we know the first principles of the universe. We know the first principles of every scale of constant relations in the universe. We know that logic is not justificationary, but is falsificationary, that the only things that can be justified are things that you can claim without claiming that they're false. That logic, as its internal consistency, isn't a test of first principles. It's only a test of internal consistency. It's not a test of external correspondence, operational possibility. And fourth, the claim of morality, it's not a test of reciprocity. I mean, I go through each of these in sequence, but the answer is, of course, that we can address commensurability. We have the first principles of the universe. We have first principles of every single stage of that you can claim. We can, with logic, test every dimension possible that's available to humans, which is identity, consistency, correspondence, operational possibility, rational choice, reciprocity, limits, completeness, parsimony, warrantability, and limits of liability. We can test all those. We can test with morality, of course. We just need to test reciprocity, where reciprocity consists of productive, fully informed, warranted, voluntary transfer of demonstrated interests, free of imposition of costs on the demonstrated interests of others by externality. So we know what these factors are, and this means that truth is the satisfaction of demand for infallibility and the question, and all truth is performative. I've just stated in terse terms that there are no undecidable propositions left. We can test any proposition for whether it's testifiable. In other words, whether it's performative truth. Anything that isn't performative that you claim is true can't be. And the first principle of the universe that conveys into logic is the one that falsifies set logic. And that's continuous recursive disambiguation. The first principle of the universe is continuous recursive disambiguation by evolutionary computation. And language likewise consists of continuous recursive disambiguation by some set of rules. So since we know all the first principles, we know what was wrong with logic, we know what was wrong with truth, we know what was wrong with morality, then as far as I can tell, philosophy in the sense of commensurability, logic, truth, and morality is closed. In other words, it's now science. But what's missing from discourse, logic, truth, and morality? What's missing is the fifth item, which is choice. In other words, preference. Can commensurability, logic, truth, and morality decide choice and preference? Of course not. Preference is only achieved by individual choice, and collective choice is only preserved by agreement. And political choice has to be resolved by some means. We prefer democratic means, in other words, the jury. And so now we're left with what can be proposed to the jury. Well, if something's commensurable, logical, truthful, and moral, it can be proposed to the jury. If it's a trade between an immoral and a moral, well, that might be a trade that we're willing to make, at which point it's not immoral any longer. So there are undecidable propositions that are political. My favorite is abortion to use, because abortion is a killing, but we kill people all the time. So whether we outlaw it or not, in other words, we prosecute it or not, is a political choice. How we come up to that choice is different. But it's not a matter of it's not a killing. It's interference with the process that terminates a life. So it's a killing. But is it murder? That's a political choice. Because when you're saying a killing is murder, you've made a political preference for it. In other words, you've made a prosecutorial preference. That means we're ensuring the life of the individual, the fetus, where the public is ensuring that against harm. And the opposition parties would say that, well, we're ensuring the livelihood of the woman at the expense of the fetus, the way we're ensuring the polity at the expense of soldiers. So, in other words, that's a political decision. In other words, it's not an undecidable proposition as to whether it's killing. It's only an undecidable proposition in the sense of whether we ensure the fetus. And that's what political means. That's what we're outlawing means, is you're ensuring something, people, against harms. And so the purpose of a polity, the purpose of politics, is to ensure people against harms. My point here was to make is that truth, commensurability, logic, truth, and morality are solved. They're science. Philosophy is left to choice within the science. If you place that criteria on philosophical history, you find it's almost as bad as theology, and you'll find that the use of philosophy since Darwin, Marx, neo-Marxism, postmodernism, anti-male feminism, PC woke, that they're worse than religion. So my view is that we know the demarcation between science and philosophy now. It's closed, and we know the difference between philosophy and theology. And the difference is science handles truth, philosophy handles choice, and theology handles wisdom. It's incremental precision from theology to philosophy to science increases precision. From science to philosophy to theology provides graceful failure. Graceful failure is important, and the opposite of graceful failure is pedagogy. So you want to teach people theology, parable, you want to teach them philosophy, reason, and you want to teach them science eventually. Why? Because you can't teach a kid a thing that requires 1,000 axes of different causality in order to understand it. You teach the person what they need. And so there's a place for everything. It's when you claim that you can argue with theology instead of advise. When you claim that philosophy can tell you the truth rather than help you make choices. And when you claim that science can help you make a choice. Now, in this place, what's the next step in the curve of science, which is fairly interesting, is law is now a science. I mean law proper, the resolution of disputes. What's the scope of the sciences? Well, the scope of the sciences now includes morality. It now includes morality, truth, logic, and discourse. Law is now the broadest range of the disciplines we've had, which is the via negativa, is the broadest range of decidability that we have. There's no human dispute we cannot solve by the science of the law. When we say I'm doing science, I'm saying that now we've unified the sciences, that the Wilsonian synthesis is complete, and that the only difference between the physical, behavioral, and evolutionary sciences, the physical science is what we depend on. It's the first, it's the prior. The actions or the behavioral sciences is the middle, what we're doing. And the evolutionary sciences is the consequence. So it's before, during, and after. So we have the complete spectrum of human action. We have the logics, which is the grammars. We have the logics and the grammars to be able to talk about those things across that spectrum. And we have testimony, which is the science of the law that I'm talking about here, to tell us whether we can logically state whatever it is in any of the grammars about a world consisting of before, during, and after laws. In my view, though, and I'm certain I'm not wrong, I'm sorry to say that to all the people, I can't be wrong.
Oh my.
If I could be wrong, I would have figured it out by now. Because
I can't be that wrong. Otherwise, I would have noticed, right?
Because there's just too much. It's closed. It's closure. We didn't have closure before, so now we have closure. Now, closure can mean two things. It can mean we know all the first principles, which we do. In other words, all the first principles for anything that is going to be decidable in matters of conflict over truth, reciprocity, logic, testimony. I mean, I'm even going to make the claim that we don't have to know anything more about the physical universe than we do.
Right.
That's a matter of whether we're going to obtain additional influence over the physical universe. Does that mean that we're not going to find new technologies that adjust us to reorder? No, but that's just going to say we have to reorganize our choices and preferences. It's not going to change whether things are true or not. And so I view philosophy as over in order to, of course, create conflict. But the point is that philosophy and science are now demarcated, and philosophy is limited to those things which are choices within the limits of the sciences, and that we know the first principles of the sciences, so we know what's commensurable, we know what's logical, we know that truth consists of and morality consists of, and we know that because I can't find anything that isn't testable by that criteria. And the reason is, of course, humans are only capable of sense perception in so many dimensions, so we can falsify each dimension. So that's my sort of argument. I think I've summed it up in, if you don't think philosophy is harmful, has been harmful, look at the difference between the French, German, and Ashkenazi counter-revolutions against Anglo-empiricism. And Anglo-empiricism is just the application of law to general knowledge, when the law in English society is just science, because the only thing that the law was concerned about was dispute resolution, and dispute resolution is purely empirical, and the means of decidability in dispute resolution is always and everywhere in Western civilization. The sovereignty, reciprocity, truth, duty, markets, and everything, because we are guaranteeing one another self-determination by self-determined means, and that's because because of the distribution of our productivity. Our agrarian productivity is so unconcentrated, in other words, we have to be distributed across these kind of farms, that a militia is necessary to form an army. In other words, there's no way of concentrating enough wealth to create a standing army until after the British agrarian, commercial, industrial revolutions kick in. So we think we invented science, but we invented everything else because our law is scientific. Why? Because our culture is scientific. Because of a glorious accident in history. The simplicity of pulses and responses to vibration in the universe are sorted into what we call experience by nothing other than prediction, which it's so ridiculously simple. It's basically, you take a body and you simply say, I have to organize pulses into prediction. Then it becomes really obvious why there's no observer.
The observer is an unnecessary fiction that we like to talk about.
And why qualia, like I was listening to objections to qualia by a whole bunch of philosophers last night. I'm like, you come so fucking wrong. So what I was saying is that a defect in an individual's perception is the same thing as telling us that we're imperceive the world. No, I mean, if nothing's wrong, we perceive the world with extraordinary precision, terrifyingly precise. If they're saying, what's the difference between seeing in the sense of our eyes observe the light rays and disambiguating it so it's meaningful, which is the disappearing airliner engine, which I don't know if you know what that example is, but there's things you just don't see changing in the background because your brain doesn't see the point of disambiguating it because it's treating it like background noise. Does that mean you don't see it? Or it means it doesn't reach, you're discounting it, right?
It's not hitting the threshold of significance.
Right, it's insignificant. And so it's like, and then it gets into color. I thought this was a great one, which this is the best example I've heard anyone say. Why can we disambiguate keys on a keyboard, notes, keyboard, if we play them together? And we can't disambiguate light. We see them together. The answer is, of course, is that the light is really fucking complicated. And of course, we all see red within. It's like, is there a marginal difference in what we see as red? No. People are colorblind and may not see red and green. They may see it as gray. But that just means they're defective. It doesn't say anything about neurology. They're just broken. It's not that our nervous system doesn't correctly sort the universe by vibrations. And so there's a big difference between the vibration of light and the vibration of sounds. And even then,
only very few people at some point can distinguish sounds. My favorite examples are the blue-black dress, the blue versus
Okay.
black gold dress. And auditorily, we have a bunch of things that people hear different words spoken in this noise, this stream of noise. Like I hear these words and somebody hears completely different words.
Ah.
Does that mean we perceive the world incorrectly, or we've artfully figured out how to confuse ourselves? We've artfully configured how to figure ourselves. And distinguishing two notes is like distinguishing two colors. I don't get it. Are you saying that yellow is an admixture of blue and red?
No, yellow is a primary color.
Green is a. I'm like, well, you're saying that we don't correctly perceive yellow. No, we actually do. We perceive it the way we perceive a chord, right? As C minor major, right? We can identify differences between chords. And I'm like, that's a fucking stupid. I mean, it's that kind of reductio absurdum nonsense that's all over the place.
But how many angels are on the head of this pin?
And I can forgive them because they're not neurologists. They don't know neurocomputation. They don't know how the nerves work. Maybe it's because they spend too much time with words and not enough time with engineering. We teach physics, we don't teach engineering.
Perhaps they believe they have to use words to generate a story that is sufficiently powerful to solve the problem. It's a form of mathiness, I think.
Yeah, it's basically like set theory is the information necessary to come out of the conclusion isn't present.
So they create fictions like the I, the verb to be, to satisfy the demand for a solution. So we invent a fictional solution to satisfy the human demand to scratch the itch.
And this isn't always the problem. I'm just saying this concept of what I call mathiness, which is the pollution of mathematical idealism across the spectrum, because we falsely believe that math is the gold standard when it's actually operations that are the gold standard. Mathematics is just a way of measuring operations. And if we can't figure out the operations, we have nothing to talk about except stories. So philosophers, we're gonna have to wait till they die. I mean, honestly, because the number of times I run into guys who are intellectually curious is that it's pretty easy to make them jump from fiction into philosophy because they're really the same thing. It's fictionalizing. And it's much harder to make the jump from storytelling and fiction instead into history, and from history into engineering.
It all comes down to behavioral economics. The old dog doesn't want to take the effort to be the low dog.
Philosophy is largely the art of fictionalizing storytelling in order to look for some sort of rational consistency that might expose us to additional information. It's true, but if you're not resulting in, the realism, naturalism, operationalism, you're basically continuing the process of making stories. And so the problem with storytelling is you might find a new association, which is an induction, but you can't falsify that induction. You can't conclude anything from the induction. Whereas if you actually reduce it to operations, you can now both engage in deduction, induction, adduction from the operations and then falsify them. So it's just this whole problem of, as you say, if you start out in this fictionalist path, which is way easier, it's easier to empathize with characters and experiences and much easier to read Harry Potter than his Fall of the Roman Empire.
Men want sense making about the world they're in. They sense something's wrong, but they no longer have the tools to know what to do about it except get frustrated. So there's this immense hunger out there. And that's why I started the Institute. As I'm like, we can just teach all I had to do was synthesize it into basically programming language. But it's not like it's not out there. It's out there for our men to understand. The problem is you got people synthesizing into bullshit essays, moralizing, 10,000 branches of shitty philosophizing, pseudo-religions. The fact is that we know all this stuff and it can be given to people. And it's during the 1700s, this shit was all formalized. And that became what we think of as the British Empire or the American civilization. But it really was just adulting with the modern state. We just scienced government instead of theologizing or philosophizing. This is why I say it's really disturbing to understand how the brain works, because we think it's the same thing you get with philosophers. They get too enamored by the experience of doing something that they read more into it than it's there. It's a really simple thing that thing on your head is doing. It's really fucking simple. There's just a lot of it. I mean, what, 86 billion neurons? I think it's probably way more than that, really. Because once you start talking about a neuron, you can talk about one of these simple ones that looks like a tree, like the one that goes from your toe to your brain. But you look at some of these dendritic structures on these neurons, it's like a planetary ecology. Holy fuck, how does that even happen? And there's a lot of those, and they're small. Once you understand how it happens, if you're trying to say, well, there's a bias toward this and that and the other thing, and we can, but it's more like, dude, if it can make a computation at will, it can go in all these directions. You got a neural column, the things can go up and down pretty easily. They get across this way, they come out this layer, they go back to this way. You can see what's going on in there. And then there's like so much space around them. So they can actually broadcast into the space around them in case there's some opportunity, but they can't broadcast far enough to reach the next neural column. So there's sort of insulation there by space. But you start going through this thing and it's like, holy shit, this is amazing. But what it does is simple. It takes that stimuli and associates it with that pixel in your eye, and it tries to compose something that's a continuous prediction out of it. That's it. And because the whole point is you got to be able to time your bodily movements, right? Coordinate your bodily movements. We had to make all that organized together. Well, that's what it is. Everything we have is an organization out of how do I time my bodily movements together? What it does is really simple. The circuit's really simple. Dude, I acquire shit. Whatever I can acquire gets my attention. I have the ability to hold my attention until something louder comes along. Okay, that's all it does. And you know what's great is you can't shut it off. So all we do when we go to sleep at night is we shut off the attention. But your fucking brain is doing that shit all night long. One of the things it's doing is rehearsing. That's why you have dreams. It's rehearsing all the memories you stored during the day until they become networks. That's why you can't remember things if you don't get sleep. What it does is simple. And they try to make it up. Well, so all this beauty and whatever in this experience, that's just auto association connecting groups of networks together so that you can possibly discover an opportunity for further acquisition. That's all that's going on. And when you're talking to people, you're just trying to find a means of acquisition. That's it. There's nothing else going on. And so we get all this stuff. We're like, but what about when I'm doing this? What are you trying to acquire? Well, I'm not trying to acquire anything. Yes, you are. What are you trying to acquire? It's so simple. It's disturbing because we've built all this nonsense. And it's just, we're incredibly simple. What's the difference between us and apes? Well, we can recurse forward in time. So I can estimate what you think, and you can think what I think, and I can think back what you might think, and you might think, you'll say, well, I got to get him to think that. So we can do this recursion. They can't do that, but they can hold what is in their head for like an hour. That's the trade-off.
Yeah,
that's the trade-off. And the more cycles you can have forward, the smarter you are. He's like, you want to be the alien creature has that really long head. But if you could have a head that long and stuff could go through that many cycles, I don't know what the hell we'd be predicting. But it'd be like chess wouldn't be a problem because the first move, you could predict the whole game. I'm talking to my doctor today, and it disturbs them when you talk. Well, the brain doesn't do that. It does this, that, the other thing.
They don't like that, huh?
They don't like that. So we've mastered this incredible range of positiva language, which means how to communicate. That means we testify, we opine, we tell stories, we create fictions, we create fictionalisms, we create huge narratives. We've got all these analogies and metaphors and parables and histories and theologies and philosophies. These are all via positiva. And we focus on the via positiva. In other words, we all try to learn it because every one of those things, because it's via positiva, presents us with an opportunity. In other words, knowledge we can use as an opportunity to think, feel, and act. And what I've said before is that what we don't study is the history of our law. We don't treat the study of law like we do the study of philosophy. And so the problem is law is what not to do. It's the study of what not to do. What I'm doing is I'm creating as sophisticated a language for law, in other words, the negative, what not to do, as we have created for the positive. Tried to rebalance the scales for meaning and truth. Meaning means an opportunity, and truth means a decidability. That sounds like a lot, but I mean, when you get down to it, I've just created the mirror image of meaning. People say, I read this philosopher or this online personality. And of course, I'm just reducing it down to which set of bullshit lies is this person using to justify a set of priors. And it's just like this little list of 5 items that this person is engaging in, and they think they're not a robot. Who am I, right? I haven't published this yet, but I hear philosophers talk today and they come on and I'm like, you are worse than the angels on the head of a pin. Because the information is actually there. It's not like it's the 15th century, where you don't have a choice. This is like the 21st century. You could just read the fucking answers. They're sitting out there. We have the internet. Everything's free. You don't even have to read all whole books in order to get an idea. There's a summary probably in Wikipedia or in an article somewhere that's reduced the whole fucking concept to like 4 sentences. There's no excuse for you to be a fucking idiot. It's why? Because the algorithm is what it is, right? It's just a stupid, simple fucking algorithm that will compute what is possible to compute with this thing we call a body and this thing we call a mind. And so human nature is completely understandable. Human history, human civilizational differences, human religious beliefs, human cultural traditions, it's all the same. It's just what cost are you willing to pay to produce that evolutionary velocity? Boom. That's it. It's just deterministic outcome, because underneath all our blah, 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 blah is some set of genetics that program that brainstem to calculate really accurately the potential to acquire. And all of this shit we do, all of this ideology, philosophy, theology, all of this pseudoscience, all of this sophistry and deceit, it's all shit. I could have added Nietzsche to that list. I always thought he was an idiot, really. I did. I said, you wrote one book. The first book is right, which is The Birth of Tragedy. And the rest of it's applied. And yeah, it's great, but it's fucking madness. Yes. Because he didn't solve the problem. He wrote incredibly persuasive young male literature because he'd identified the problem, but he didn't solve it. Of course, solving the problem was hard. I mean, it's just intellectually embarrassing to read all this. I don't pick on the sophists, because they're too intellectual. The right-wing sophistry guys that are always trying to make some philosophical argument that is really rather dim. These people they're just children wanting Daddy Hitler to come save them in some form or another. And they're embarrassing. It's a sign of how far we've fallen.
It's interesting. I'm watching the philosophers philosophize and discuss the nature of history and its kind of current events in their philosophical way. And it's like, okay, getting a handle on how do I talk to these guys that is based on the objective reality as opposed to the fantasy land.
The problem they face is they're consumed with the good. They're good first rather than true first. Once you know it's true, you can discover a potential good.
Right.
But if you search for good first, you haven't narrowed the field of ignorance, error, bias, and deceit sufficiently. So it's sort of like trying to cheat, which is really what it is. Everybody's trying to be cunning instead of smart or wise. And the truth is, there's only one way out of every problem, and that's the scientific and technological method, which is what's true and what's possible. Of the things that are possible, what's good? Instead of what would be good, how do we make that possible? You've probably created a field of potentials that almost all of which are false. Now, the difference between my work and most philosophy is I don't leave it at the abstract moral, I leave it at crime. And so you're not just making an error like we are in philosophy, you're committing a crime. So under reciprocity, consisting of productive, fully informed, warranted, voluntary exchange, free of imposition of costs upon the demonstrated interests of others by externality, then you haven't committed a crime. But otherwise, you have committed a crime. Now, some of these crimes are small, basically white lies. Some of these are medium, or they are gray lies. In other words, you're evading a cost. And some of them are black lies, which means you're imposing costs upon others. And some of them are what we call purple lies, which they're evil, which their purpose is to exclusively impose costs on others, regardless of the gain to you. So we're not talking about philosophy as some bridge between science and theology where you're forgiven. We're talking about law, which is in science and law, which means you're accountable for your actions.
Now we're back to these philosophers that I was chatting with and the wishful thinking and magical thinking. And that this goes to alchemy, okay? And you've heard of the philosopher's stone. The philosopher's stone turns base metals into gold. And so the philosopher's stone that they are pursuing appears to be the magical incantation that allows us all to cooperate together and peaceably exist. And they're attempting to concoct it and create a new formulation of this nebulous thinking that everyone can nod and agree to, and we can move forward into the glorious future of gold.
That's because they don't understand that epistemology must be through adversarial trial and error competition, and they're trying to eliminate competition in favor of cooperation. All that means is they're trying to create stagnation, which is that what every single fucking thinker has tried to do in history. So what has happened with Confucius, with...
And here's what they say. They will say, let me think about that. Just wait. Let me think about that. I'll be back to you tomorrow with a...
So our solution is simple. Maximize adversarial competition, but prohibit adversarial irreciprocity. The thing is, we're saying we don't get there by claiming what's good. You get the good by eradicating the maximum of the bad, leaving people open all goods. They don't have to agree. In fact, we don't want them to agree because it decreases the time-space continuum that they're experimenting in. They're decreasing computational permutations, or they're decreasing the number and speed of computational velocity. And so what they're searching for is actually cancer. They're searching for the absence of innovation and change. They think it can be changed by consensus when it's actually consensus that generates resistance to change.
Right, stagnation is entropic function, because now you're eliminating differences that make a difference.
See, they're still trying to solve the ancient problem of what should we all believe? Well, we don't have to believe anything other than that we want to eliminate the maximum amount of ignorance, error, bias, and deceit, and create the maximum scope and their surface area of uncontrolled experimentation. See, what they want to do is they don't want to do the work themselves. So this is the secret. They don't want to do the work themselves. They don't want to demonstrate demonstrated competency. They want to just talk and get other people to do the work. The problem is, the further you are from the cause and effect cycle, the least you are able to adjust and be falsified. So we've said this forever, is that the academy tends to go the wrong direction. And this is why. The state tends to go the wrong direction. The people tend to go the wrong direction. What happens is that some people defect from the wrong direction, and you can't predict which defection will succeed. But it's always defection from a direction that creates an innovation. So the problem is, we want to create the maximum opportunities for defection within the limits of reciprocity. And so they're trying to do the opposite. It's a thin veneer. Consciousness is a thin veneer that allows us to negotiate. It's a thin veneer that allows us to negotiate with others. And the rest of the beauties of consciousness are a byproduct. Consciousness isn't useful other than the fact that it's a byproduct of having to predict one another's intentions, emotions, and wants. That's it. Consciousness is a byproduct of cooperation. Otherwise, completely unnecessary. It's a really costly thing. But because we get that, all of a sudden, as a byproduct, we get this thing of imagining tools and imagining how to use technologies and whatever and organize. We get all these wonderful things as this accidental byproduct. Let's understand consciousness as we understand it. This thing about all the stories we tell in our head, which is various ways of computing, we don't think of it that way. We're running simulations in order to figure out how we might get something or avoid something. Right. You know, it's just a kind of computing, but it's a thin fucking veneer. The more I'm aware of this, the more it just creeps me out a little bit. It's like, it wasn't his idea, but it's like the elephant and the rider. Yeah. The elephant and the rider. I mean, we don't really get, we're like the flea on the riding the elephant. We're not the driver.
You don't even get any reins, man.
Yeah, if we could scratch it and peck it enough, it might go one direction. We're just along for the ride.
I mean, that's funny.
People seek consensus, agreement, or good instead of what's true and reciprocal. When they do that, they think in justificationary terms, which is pseudoscience, sophistry, philosophy, theology, and morality. So they actually have a system of measurement that excludes the information that they need in order to come to the conclusion they desire, which is hysterical. I mean, In retrospect, they don't realize they're this generation's version. Talking about angels dancing on the head of a pin. That's what they're doing. They're just talking about angels dancing on the head of a pin because the framework they're using for discourse prohibits the causality. The causality they're trying to discover so they can come to an answer, a solution with. So it's just hysterical to me. I keep saying this is like we're the equivalent of the Enlightenment against the theologicals and the scientists against the rationalists. We're just sitting here saying, well, it's actually operationalists. Why? Because we have enough knowledge now to speak operationally. And so the problem for us is looking back and saying, well, I mean, you guys are really confident because you're in the institution, but your institution is going to be replaced by the operationalists, just like you replaced the rationalists. Rationalists replaced the theologians.
It's getting to the point where I can't listen. I follow Closer to the Truth, curly-haired Jewish guy, physicist. This guy so desperately wants some part of magical thinking to survive. He interviews all these philosophers. I almost can't listen to them. They're intellectually embarrassing. And especially since I've understood how simple consciousness is. All this debate.
Oh my, there's a lot of talk about this.
It's just, it's so childlike. When if you.
It's like ghosts. We're talking about some ghost stories or something.
That's exactly what it is.
Because it's the ghost in the machine. Like, okay.
So I love Yasha Bach. He's German, so he's got to put things poetically. It's a German thing. And so he says theology or the Bible, it's childhood dreams of a God. And I hear these philosophers and I hear adolescent dreams of man. Right. And it just sounds so childish to me.
I was listening to Nick Land yesterday. It's so fascinating to listen to him because he's definitely on the Continental side, which is you do philosophy with rich networks of complex ideas, right? It's the opposite of parsimony. And it's basically the old Plato versus Aristotle argument. I work in the Aristotelian method, which is analytic, and he works in the Platonic method, which is literary. But what's interesting is, of course, when I listen to Nick, who, I basically agree with on everything. I mean, I actually have to concentrate pretty hard because the density of what he's saying and his capacity to use it. I mean, to blend all these concepts together in these rich, it's sort of like going to a restaurant and the chef is like trying to bring out some different set of tastes, right? And it's this rich, complex thing, which if you want to, you can either experience indirectly, or you can say, oh, you can experience and then disambiguate into what the chef has done. And I don't envy a lot of people, but I actually envy him because he says such witty things. And it's just the kind of thing I can't do. I don't know if, that's how most of us are, but I don't think envy is the right word. Admire, right? Or am jealous of, or would like to attain. Envy is a negative thing, but his ability to come up with these witticisms, of course, he's both British and he is a master of his domain. And he was one of the first accelerationists, if not the first person to put it into terms. And so I go through that stuff and I'm just awed that somebody can produce that kind of thing, but it illustrates that you can create extraordinary complexity either in the literary Continental method or in the analytic Anglo method, the scientific and legal versus the philosophical and literary. And it's just fascinating to me that you can both try to say about the same things, but storytelling is always more suggestible. It conveys meaning so richly, which you can then disambiguate. Whereas trying to build stuff analytically from first principles, it's hard. It's easier to have the story and then learn the causality. But if you become so good at the story, then why do you need to disambiguate into first principles and causes? Well, the difference, of course, is that my side, the analytic, we favor decidability, which is conflict resolution. And they favor meaning, which is organization of a body into a movement. And so this is my normal conflict with, I want to go live, I'm getting older, so I need to go do it soon, but I want to go live in Germany for a while so that I can decompose German culture, because I know that they've got it right, but the way they talk about it is through suggestion. It's a very complex, rich philosophical tradition that instead went from the church where the English tradition went more from the Analytic, which was the legal and Thomist tradition. And you see that you still have an underlying Germanic civilization in both the Anglo-Analytic and the German Continental literary tradition, and that there's a value to each of those. One, of course, is meaning and coherence, and the other is decomposition and decidability. But in essence, it means that the German method is actually better as a religion, a civic religion, whereas the English method is better as a means of science and government law. You find this, and it's like, how do you bring those together? Like, it took a lot of work to turn Christianity into the 5 basic principles underneath it and unite it with science. But the Germans seem to have done it without doing that. In other words, they seem to have done it through their evolution of Christianity into Protestantism, into Kantianism, into the what we call the phenomenalist traditions, because their tradition doesn't ignore and separate the intuitionistic, the experiential, the social, and the psychological from what they're trying to achieve, whereas the English does. These are just matters to be expressed in scientific terms, which, of course, Adam Smith ends up being morality becomes economics. So you get this wonderful dichotomy. And of course, I've got the English down, but of course, I'm English. Right?
Right. That made it easier.
I'm an Anglo-American, I'm Anglo-Saxon American. So that's what I've been sort of working on. It's the problem of you have measurement on one side and meaning on the other. And you actually want to have both to produce a compromise of action in the middle. Meaning by rational understanding is what we call education. But you have meaning purely by suggestion in mythology, and you have meaning by imitation, ritual, environmental formation on the extreme. And on the other way, you have reducing everything to mathematics and first principles, which is devoid of any intuitionistic content whatsoever, because that's what measurement means. And it's this wonderful set of grammars we get to choose from. The problem is that we always want to reduce everything to the simplest set of principles. And so the problem is we've all developed a set of principles that are somewhere on the spectrum. And then we wonder why we can't organize, because we're all working at different levels of precision with different means of friction of informational transmission. And the fact that we actually make it work is kind of fascinating to me. It's another example of the division of temporal labor, but it's actually the division of the utility of neural economies or function neural economies, given different demographic distributions. So in some sense, it's mechanically comprehensible, but understanding that mechanically comprehensible still puts us in a position of saying, how do we achieve what appears to be impossible? The marriage of meaning and measurement. How do we produce a norm that collapses meaning, which is the narrative, which we hope to be as suggestive as possible, drastically depending on intuition instead of reason, which is so costly. And on the other side, produce decidability. In other words, produce conflict resolution or produce measurement and more sophisticated information, and especially scale. How do we do that while maintaining, how do we create a bridge? Well, of course, the natural bridge would be to reduce everything to the smallest number of first principles, which is basically natural law. And so if you create everything based on this midpoint, which is a set of narratives about natural law, you can then increase the meaning by exposition and fictionalism, or you can increase the precision by measurement. So that's why I say it should be possible to converge theology, philosophy, ideology, economics, law, politics, physical sciences into a single narrative. And I'm trying desperately to do that. The only question is, it's like everybody says who does the same thing. It's one thing to start at 40 and another thing to start at 20. Well, how am I going to finish this and get to religion? How am I going to produce that meaning? We're producing the measurement because really, what is P law? It's the science of decidability, right? I mean, it's decision. It means it can expose meaning. In other words, explain causality behind meaning. But we are still animals that use a neural economy that does not naturally disambiguate, but naturally aggregates. And so how are we going to get to the point where we have what I would call a religion, which is a group evolutionary strategy embodied in a binding narrative that reinforces a metaphysics through intuition, ritual, and experience and oath, rather than requiring you to know this vast algorithmic process you and I are enumerating in order to work? Well, the answer, of course, is you need to have both the literary and the analytic. You need to have meaning and decidability. Well, you want the least friction between meaning and decidability, and that is to produce an operational narrative of natural law by which we can test the coherence of meaning and consistency of meaning, and by decidability, well, we can prevent the harms of frauds, denial, right, all those other things. That was just what was on my mind this morning while going through Nick. Now, at this point, Nick is been writing fiction, and it's really close to continental occultist thinkers, right-wing continental occult. Most of them are German or Italian, but they're all over the place. But they are trying to create a mythology, a secular mythology. Now, Nick's stuff is up in that, except it's as deep as theology. Right? I read one of his books, about half one of his books yesterday, and I was like, how does a human do this? I can understand like Heidegger. Heidegger is trying to invert verb and noun. He's trying to invert external existence with internal experience. And this is the whole point of the phenomenalist tradition. German language and metaphysics is highly psychological, where ours is more analytical and legal. It's more personal to them, and ours is more political. So I can read Heidegger and I'm like, well, it's really painful. It's almost impossible to say what he's really trying to think. And the fact that he can try to do it is, it's a work of verbal genius to some degree, but at least I could say I can understand how to get there. When I read some of these guys that write what is really an attempt to draft modern mythology that is an alternative, because science fiction really has been our modern mythology, and trying to continue the continental tradition. I just look at that and I'm like, I could never do that. I just could never do it. No matter how hard I worked at it, I couldn't do it. And so I see that was kind of admiration. But you do need both extremes. We need to find a way in the middle that makes the measurement between meaning and measurement, or meaning and decidability, as commensurable. This gets to the free will question, which is the stupidest fucking question of philosophy. Free will is, I have the choice to make moral and immoral decisions within my cultural context, within my range of competency. So I'm responsible. In other words, other people hold me responsible for the exercise of my will within my domain of competence. We actually forgive people when they lack the competence and they don't know it. But it's when people don't exercise will, in other words, they violate those rules we have established and cause harm to others, then we punish them. But we're pretty forgiving. The difference between crime and tort is just that, is that I sought to commit a crime, and a tort is just, well, how the fuck was I supposed to know that? Well, I got to pay for it because I paid the price of ignorance. And then there's stuff that you just can't be held responsible for. I was born with this particular defect, and since we insure each other, the people guarantee to take care of you because of this defect. This is just the spectrum of, it's not a crime anymore when it's completely outside of your control. There's no way for you to be knowledgeable of it, or no way to predict it. So it's not your fault. Therefore, we insure you. We insure one another a tort, which is, you didn't think of it. You didn't do it on purpose. It just sort of happened. But, you're still responsible for your outcomes. And a crime is like, we're going to kick your ass because not only did you not do due diligence defending yourself, but you caused harm by intent, immoral intent. So we have this spectrum that we live under, which, if you just see what I did there, is the whole secret to P law, is if you've got a concept, if you can't serialize it to between its two endpoints, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. And it's just so fucking obvious. Because why? Because it's just another goddamn parallel calculation by a massive computer called us, with massive computers called neural stacks, in a system that's performing evolutionary computation with fragmentary information and great adversarial composition at enormous scale across centuries of time. But we're just fucking bots. We might as well be atoms, right? I mean, it doesn't make any difference. We're doing the same shit. The difference is we can remember, so we can try to outwit it. And half the time we're trying to outwit it by lying, cheating, stealing, and thieving and murdering each other, instead of, the truth is, evolutionary competition is difficult. It's a tragedy. And the only way to do it is to love each other. We're just computers. We are. I'm sorry. The philosophers need to be disappointed. You don't use wisdom as if it's logic. You don't use philosophy as if it's science. The difference is, how many deductions can you make from a wisdom literature, from a philosophical statement, from a scientific statement, and from a mathematical statement? You can make a lot of deductions from a mathematical description because that's its fucking purpose, right? With science, you can make quite a few second order, third order, fourth order deductions from a scientific rule, right? I mean, we do lots of them. From philosophy, you can sort of build a model that you can make decisions from. But wisdom literature isn't structured to depend on your reason. It's structured to depend on your intuition. So you can't make these second and third order derivations from it. Somebody said this yesterday, which is why I'm bringing it up. If you can find it written by an Aspie dispassionate Anglo, it's probably worth reading. If it wasn't written by a dispassionate autistic Anglo, it's probably not. And that's disturbing to me. And it appears to be true. I go through them and it's like, well, I mean, you get most of everything from a very small minority of upper middle class or upper class Europeans. They're all Germanic and the vast majority are Anglo. You get a lot of other nonsense across the spectrum from everybody else. In philosophy in general, if you look at the record, the evidence, not of the claims, but of the evidence, philosophy does not account for costs. And the difference between philosophy and science is the accounting of costs.
The question is only whether you're using behavior mod, which is, you could call it education or training or discipline or whatever you want to call it. When you're modifying behavior, so are you trying to modify behavior to correspond to reality or diverge from it? Are you trying to modify behavior to produce reciprocity or reciprocity? So it's not so much that mythology is bad or philosophy is bad or pseudoscience is bad. I mean, the point is, because when you get to science, basically you're testifying that it's correspondent, consistent with reality, and it's reciprocal. Before you get there, there's all sorts of means of diverging from what's reciprocal and consistent correspondent with reality. So there's a lot of room for manipulation as you move from science to philosophy, science to history to philosophy to religion, to theology and mythology.
Right.
So there's more room because there's less constraint.
Right.
The more constraint, the more parsimonious, the more constraint, the less room there is for
misinterpretation.
However, you have the inverse of cost effect, which is just really easy to use anthropomorphism. It's really easy to use philosophy of reason. It's really easy to use history, and it's really easy to use science. Well, it's easy to use those things if you have a requisite knowledge. But I don't know if you remember what it's like to read history when you're a kid. It's like, I don't know what they're referring to. You don't have enough models.
There's not enough background, right?
And when you first get philosophy, which philosophy are you talking about? Analytic philosophy like I do or the logicians do? Or are you talking about philosophy like wisdom literature that's based on just reason without any appeal to the supernatural? Or you're talking about mythology, which is an analogy that applies to supernatural because there's nothing else you can use to explain phenomenon. So the cost of education goes up with the knowledge required to do it. So the only question is, as you go down in simplicity, the room for the deception and irreciprocity or error or bias, but that's okay when you're teaching morals because morals are universals. But when you're teaching sciences, you're trying to teach measurements, that's something different. So the point I want to make is I don't want to demonize mythology and philosophy.
That's correct. That's right.
What I'm trying to do is separate the fact that these are means of education from the fact that they're also increasingly vulnerable to falsehood and reciprocity.
Philosophy in the Western tradition is a means by which the middle class tries to persuade the aristocracy to do something by rational means. That's what I see philosophy as. So certainly its origin. We have people that are quite good, but they're either too aggressive or they are too, what we would call philosophical rather than scientific. And that seems to be pretty common. You can find a great guy who's into philosophy, the literary model of analogy, and you can get great thinking, but they can't make hard decisions. I think it takes the entrepreneur, the dad. I mean, you have to be in a condition where, or develop the habit of making hard decisions where you don't have a choice not to decide. So, Brandon and most of us are entrepreneurs, have been entrepreneurs.
I want to talk to the philosophers because I'm very curious what they're thinking, they think they're doing, because they don't seem to be well focused and they're very agreeable about what they're doing. And they're not totally wrong about what they're doing. It's just like, what do they think they're achieving by the way they're doing it?
Can what they're doing succeed?
I can't see how it can.
You have to ask them.
I
How
will.
do
That's
they-
exactly because I don't. My opinion has no bearing on the conversation. I'm just curious what they think is going on.
I'll tell you what they will do. I'm going to guess.
This is
because
good.
I
It's like
ran- I
predictive.
run into this all the time. Some variation of we don't try to figure that out. What was that, Peter? I just remember him saying that to me. Well, we're not trying to solve that problem. And I was so dumbstruck by the honesty and rapidity of the response. It's like, I think I need to leave now.
I've had my fill. Thank you very much. Because you're like dealing with someone who's apparently not serious, right?
No, they're serious.
Well, they think they're serious, but they're not serious if we don't try to figure this out. It's like children running around in the park.
Look, let's like this. We can't look back in history and moralize about people in the past or judge people in the past. You can say, well, that turned out to be a bad mistake, or you guys made a wrong bet early and that's just biting you all the way, right? And there's stuff like that. But when you look at people, we now have, I mean, you're exposed to this, right? Everything fits together like puzzle pieces that's stupidly simple. They don't know that. So we can't go back to these people and say, I mean, I do it because I'm just frustrated. I say, well, that's fucking stupid. Well, what I really mean is I'm frustrated about the state of affairs and I'm just expressing it in colloquial prose. But you can't go to these guys. They don't know this stuff. It's like going back into the 1600s and when they think about humors,
I know this is
and you're trying to tell them about bacteria.
it's
right,
so
I mean-
rude. What you're doing is rude, man.
What?
Because it's like this. It's paternalistic, man. I'm not trying to judge the people. I'm just trying to talk to them about what it is that they think they're doing. It is to develop an interview pattern that is trying to understand what they think is occurring. Because I think that we will all agree that the humanity is in a significant crisis and we have a lot of problems that need to be resolved and we have a limited time to get it done. And the question is the tools you're using provide sufficient explanatory power to understand the problems that humanity faces?
And offer a solution.
And yeah, then you can derive a solution from that.
And
And
how
it's
would
like-
that solution be brought about?
Right.
Because
And it's
that's
like-
where it goes to hell.
Well, it's like, otherwise you're just fiddling around. And I'm not going to say that to them. It will become evident, I think, by conversation. Because it's like, who's offering solutions? How are solutions to be derived? And to explain it to me, because I'm all ears. I will listen to you. Tell me how this is going to help. Because I think that you're trying to help. You're seriously trying to help. But it's like, are you using the right tools? And are we having the right mechanisms in play to make it happen? And it draws attention to the answers that are productive.
Well, I'm going to bet every one of them ends up saying, I don't fucking know, in one way or the other. I
And it's
know,
like that. So it's like,
I know that's what would happen if I was talking to them. I know.
but it goes like this. Ready for this is awful because it's the follow-up question. It's once that I don't know card is played, why should anybody pay attention to you if you don't know, sir? Because I don't understand why you think that what you're offering is worthy of attention since you don't claim to know.
Well, I mean, then after you have the first interview, nobody will talk to you. You know who's a really good, I absolutely think this guy is horrible. He does a video series called Closer to the Truth, and he panders to these people. You know, he's your typical little Jewish nerd who wants to get attention and has found out that interviewing people is really way more fun than having a real job. And so what he does is he panders to all these philosophers. And I think it would be worthwhile for you to look at, no, it's incredibly important because you've got to get out of that. You've got to ask them questions without ever coming to that conclusion you just stated. It could be implied, but you can't get there.
Get there.
You have to all but get there and say at the end, so how do you suppose we're going to solve this problem as a people, as humans? How are we going to solve this problem? And so you're trying to get them to the open-ended discussion, but you can't go in there and bait someone into an interview only to tell them they're full of shit. I mean, you'll get one interview and you won't get any more after that. So what you have to do is let the audience understand. And the more subtle you are, the better it is. So what you're trying to do is say, collect the opinion of different people on how they think this problem will be solved. And their absence of a solution and how that solution would be implemented and whether those people would tolerate that solution. Those are the questions you want to ask. And all you're trying to do is say, I'm trying to collect an understanding of what's out there. What do the big thinkers in the world think? You're going to be
That's
surprised at how shitty it is, because I know. Yeah, what they're really doing is saying, at least in philosophy, the reason to study philosophy today is to study law. And the reason is law today is stated as philosophy, not as science. And so what philosophy teaches you is human error. In other words, it's primarily not to do things right, but how to not do something wrong. That's the only reason.
At least it's not a bad thing.
I mean, study like academic philosophy. The second reason is to study the history of the evolution of human thought. This tells you a little bit about human beings. At the end of your journey, I promise you, it is a waste of your fucking time. If you read Aristotle and Plato, everything's a fucking footnote until you get to Smith and Hume, Darwin and Menger and Maxwell. I mean, it's just a complete waste of fucking time. So what you will find is what the historians all find, is the answers in history, not in philosophy. If religion is the childhood dreams of a god, philosophy is the adolescent dreams of man. And that's all. That's all it is. Nothing more.
The problem you get in school is learn what the teacher tells you, not what is. So it sort of falls into the verbal people who can play that game. But the systematizing people just prefer science and engineering, programming, whatever, because it is internally consistent. It's consistent and correspondent. But the verbal layers, the ethics, the politics, the law, these are a verbal logic, in other words, declared logic, that's not been solved yet. So it's this problem I have with philosophy, which is
Wait. There's a thing there. There's the verbalisms right above consistency and correspondence. It's not properly attached, and that's what we're solving for here.
so for systematizing, we're seeking this internal consistency and external correspondence. But if you have human beings, they're seeking negotiation strategies. They're just seeking agreement. And so you have all this verbalism that goes on. So it's philosophy and law as we understand it, and literary analogy and political pseudoscience and positive law, all this other crap. And it's not been scienced yet. And so you have people that are drawn both directions. But then you get people, then you start seeing weird things happen in the 20th century. Elon Musk be my favorite example, who like me is always saying, well, we just work with first principles. But do you know what the fuck that means? It doesn't mean axioms. It's not axiomatic. It's natural laws. What are the first principles of the physical universe? It's science. So he's saying first principles. Well, that's true. But what's the first principle of any given science? There's no first principle in law that we can figure out as they practice it, other than state authority. In other words, their claims of legitimacy.
Curt, you've done it. You've distilled it down to its essential
I
function.
have, but it's like
wonderful.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Like people know about calculus, but they don't know how to do calculus. So the reason calculus matters is social proof. That's the problem here. It's like people still deny Darwin, despite the knowledge and the social proof. So I just figure I'm at the end of this chain of guys who starts with really abstract stuff that isn't so material, like the earth is round, heliocentrism, Darwinian evolution, economic cooperation. And I'm at the end here. And I'm like, well, after you do genetics and IQ and all this other stuff, and you learn logics and language and whatever, we know both about physics, you can see the pattern. There's this. The difference is I'm telling you all this shit you don't want to hear. Most. Well, you don't want to hear Darwin. You certainly don't want to hear that Darwinianism applies to everything in life, especially social orders. You certainly don't want to listen to Doolittle tell you, well, all we're doing is basically lying to each other. It's really, it was one thing when Darwin came out with the Voyage of the Beagle literature, right? But the population was sort of positive at that point and looking for an answer. At this point, the population has been undermined, and we're at the point where right now where Socrates and Aristotle got killed. They wanted to kill Aristotle. And so we're trying to come out as Socrates and Aristotle and saying, this isn't working, guys. And I'm like, well, they killed Socrates and they tried to kill Aristotle. And I'm thinking I end up on one of those. So we're in a different place. The other thing is that, when the church has been oppressing you and it's become common knowledge that the church is corrupt but a necessary institution, we have this position where the government is corrupt and a necessary institution, and the academy is corrupt as hell, but a necessary institution. I mean, we went from taking power from the church and giving it to the academy and state. Who are we giving power to now? You know, it's one thing to give it back to the people, which is what we're doing, but the people aren't an institution. Can I just interject something? I like to shit on, you know, Bernard O'Kastrup and who's that British guy? It's a fucking lunatic that keeps saying birds have some spiritual thing in them.
I'm thinking of Sheldrake.
No, that's another one. Shit, you know, you're gonna ruin my. If you keep piling them on, the task will seem insurmountable. And I keep getting these likes on me shitting on Bernardo Castro, right? For people, and then his defenders are all like, they're morons, and it's hysterical, right? Rupert Sheldrake. So it's like Sheldrake is basically a lunatic. Kastrup is a moron. And I like put most philosophers somewhere underneath Kastrup, right? And then you get to the people who are vaguely not stupid. Most philosophers right now, they're fucking embarrassing. I mean, at least if you get to somebody like Zizek, right? Slavoj Zizek, he's fucking entertaining, but he's not, he claims to be he's really not. He's just a guy who bitches for a living, and everybody likes to listen to the fact that his bitching is basically a comedy routine, right? But he's not really a philosopher. But even if you get into the people who aren't morons, like the guys in the cognitive science discipline, they're still in this woo-woo land, and it's just, you know, consciousness. I'm like, dude, the fucking science is here. It's over, okay? Get out of it. Your career is over. Write the final book saying that we've transitioned.
Let's just close the book.
Just go away.
I am fascinated by that conversation, which is, I find it to be just a silly distraction. What are you talking about this for? Consciousness. It's like, I'm not interested in it. I'm not interested.
No.
It doesn't interest me in the least place. It's like, it seems like just a diversion.
Well, yeah, but I mean, people like those, what we call philosophical conundrums, because it gives them something to think about. And it's an unsolvable problem from their perspective and lets them try to understand themselves and man. So I sort of get it. It's like pondering the existence of God, or, you know, the physicists pondering the origin and consequence of the universe, or philosophers pondering consciousness and qualia. It's all just jerking off.
How
Right?
many angels can dance on the head of
Yeah,
a
it's the
man,
same
right?
fucking
It's like,
thing, you know. But you know, I understand the drive. I
yeah.
understand why we let people collect money for it, get salaries for it, get research grants for it. I mean, come on. You know, there's guys I even like. There's guys I like, and they're not 100% wrong, but they just won't write the book. You know, they're like leaving it up to guys like, I don't want to write that book. You're the guy in philosophy. Say philosophy's over. Write the book on the end of philosophy. You know, just get together. You know.
Wait, so it's Nietzschean. It's not God is dead. Philosophy is dead.
Philosophy's dead. There's no room for philosophy left. What there is room is for philosophy as choice. In other words, there is no science left to philosophy. There is only choice. There's an infinite room for discussing preference.
Right.
There's no end. There's never going to be an end
That's right.
to discussing for preference. So that's the job of philosophers. But these guys that trying to say goods or truths or whatever, and I'm like, you're a bunch of pseudoscientific ass clowns. We've known the answer now, right? I mean, it's out there. Write the book, philosophy's over. And I'm specifically thinking about a few that are rather ponderous, one in particular, philosopher that's currently working in California, which everybody knows by the size of his beard. So just write the book. It's fucking over, okay? We can close philosophy departments and go home. And then once we've closed philosophy departments, we can create more law departments and convert law to a science. And then we're sort of fucking done with this problem. But this woo-woo generation it's just religion for midwits that graduate from liberal arts degrees. It's pseudoscientific religion for midwits. It's freaking exasperating. I mean, I would eat any of these philosophers for lunch, and they'd never agree to argue with me, because the minute they talk to me, they would know what would be true. I can't even get Hoppe, who I basically want to congratulate, to debate me.
Do you feel better now, Curt? I let you go on a rant because I think the audience will appreciate letting you hearing you tear about. It's like watching a bull run around in his pen, getting mad at the world. It's like, where's all the damn cows?
But that doesn't mean that you don't go into and see the Hegelian version for what it is that it's an approach to creating a pseudoscience or a secular theology. Just like Kant's view of rationalism is essentially a pseudoscience, but the value in their pseudoscience is that Germanic phenomenalism tries to maintain a relationship between experience and the world, whereas the English completely divorces it in the Greek model, where there's the purely scientific or a managerial view or aristocratic view of the world, and the emotional view is simply a matter of leaving that up to women and peasants. And whereas the French model, of course, is the peasants running things, and then the Jewish model, of course, is the gypsies running things. So if you want to reduce consciousness to its function,
I'm getting my pen out. Go.
it's a little dot sign on your head that rolls by all the terms of cooperation, and your opinion doesn't mean anything. It's just like I want. You know, everything out of your mouth is just I want.
Right?
And every time I think of it, I go back to writing software for robots. But once you realize that all the things doing it running around is because I want.
Oh no.
You realize that that's all people are doing. You're like, I want.
That must have been quite disturbing to discover that. People are behaving just like my robot.
Yeah, and my dumb fucking robot. And so once I realized that, I'm like, I tell people I was depressed for like 6 months. It's like I could never look at people the same again. I want. And that's all that's going on. There's nothing else going on. It's just peacock feathers to color. I want. That's it. Wear an earring.
Oh my.
Put a hat on. It's verbal decoration for I want. Some people are better at verbal peacock feathers. Where is your homeostasis, right? Where is your, can't make my finger go that way. I'll do it this way. Right? Do you bias towards empathizing, or you bias or sympathize? Are you which means, do you bias for internal consistency with the group or external correspondence with reality? Right? I mean, it's the same fuck. I mean, we're just freaking thermometers. I mean,
That's awful. That's even worse than being a bot.
Really?
A bot has some dignity. Thermometers are nearly without dignity.